24 hours before launch. Russia has threatened NATO to cease providing Ukraine with weapons and ammunition for weeks, and at last it's made good on its promise to take military action against any NATO convoys bringing such aid into the country. Just inside the Ukrainian border, a convoy of NATO vehicles is strafed by 2 Russian Su-25s. The unarmed transports are decimated by gunfire and rockets deployed by the Russian jets. There are no survivors. 23 hours before launch. Verification of the deserted convoy has finally reached the desk of the President of the United States. The convoy was being manned by Polish soldiers who'd helped their Ukrainian counterparts unload American C-130s and pack up the much-needed war supplies inside of Polish territory. The shipment of modern weapons was safe as long as it remained outside of Ukraine, but immediately upon crossing the border, Russia declared it a legal military target. Now the President of the US has a very difficult decision to make, and he immediately sets up a secure call with the heads of several NATO nations. 19 hours, 24 minutes before launch. Earlier in the war, NATO warned Russia that an attack on any of its convoys would constitute an Article 5 response. After a lengthy and heated discussion, the United States, Great Britain, France, Spain, Norway, Germany, and Poland all invoke Article 5 of the alliance. An attack on one is an attack on all. Other NATO members are being brought up to date as their leadership is being informed of the attack. Because the attack was not directly inside NATO territory, some members of the alliance, like Turkey, are having serious reservations. 2 hours before launch. The United States, Great Britain, France, Poland, and Germany have all been prepared for the possibility of an attack by Russia, either into Poland or on Polish transports and logistics personnel assisting the Ukrainians. The 5 states decide to send Russia a strong message, and combat planes kept on alert for such an eventuality have been taking to the skies already for the last half hour. A massive lightning strike force of NATO planes is approaching various Russian military targets in Kaliningrad, Ukraine, and even along Russian borders itself. 1 hour, 18 minutes before launch. NATO planes overwhelm Russian defenses, who are completely unprepared for NATO's massive response. The attack purposely avoids striking Russian troop concentrations and instead lays waste to supply and fuel depots, runways, logistics hubs, and air defense sites. The Russian military giant has proved itself to be clumsy and inept in modern combat. And while a few NATO jets are lost to Russian air defenses, the attack is an overwhelming success. It's hoped that the attack will be enough to deter Russia from further aggression, and the targets were specifically picked in order to avoid large casualties for just this reason. NATO is still hoping to avoid all-out war with Russia, but the attack against a Polish convoy carrying NATO weapons simply cannot be ignored. 19 minutes before launch. Reports of NATO airstrikes have been rolling into Russia's general staff for the last hour and 8 minutes. The attack was a complete and total humiliation for Russia, as its much vaunted air defense network was easily suppressed by a massive quantity of highly capable NATO planes. The resulting chaos has produced few military casualties, but opened up serious vulnerability gaps along the Russian border, inviting further incursion of NATO air power. Perhaps worst of all, it's shown that the nation cannot simply match the overpowering technological and doctrinal superiority of NATO's professional militaries. But the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, has been prepared for this. He has only one last card left to play, the only thing keeping NATO from absolutely steamrolling his forces in Ukraine and relegating Russia to a third-rate world power for the next century: nuclear weapons. Putin will send a message of his own. If he fails to, NATO will understand that it has near-complete impunity to attack Russia from the air by exploiting the gaps it created in its first assault along the Russian air defense network. An aide rushes over to President Putin carrying the Cheget, Russia's equivalent to the nuclear football. Much like the American version, the Cheget carries inside of it sealed authorization codes that relay President Putin's orders to his general staff. Putin selects his desired option and transmits the code to the general staff. The signal is uplinked directly to the Kavkaz secret communications network that links the senior-most Russian leadership together. Verified as authentic by the general staff, which had already been gathered beforehand, the signal is then relayed directly to local weapons commanders. This is one of 2 ways for Russia to launch its nuclear arsenal, the second being its dead hand or perimeter system. This command system allows Russia to launch its nukes even if its entire senior leadership is eliminated in one sudden decapitation strike. Dead Hand was developed in response to U.S. advances in submarine-launched nuclear weapons, which in the 1980s became capable of the precision required for a decapitation strike with only a 3-minute warning thanks to the Trident D5. Using a network of seismic, light, radioactivity, and pressure sensors, Dead Hand can trigger a full-scale retaliatory response even if the entire senior Russian leadership is annihilated in one strike. To get the alert out, a specially modified ICBM is launched which carries a powerful transmitter instead of a nuke and relays a mass launch order across the entire Russian nuclear triad. 13 minutes before launch, a single launch order has been relayed to an RS-12M1 Topol-M ICBM unit. The road mobile launcher is harder to destroy in a first strike than ICBMs based on static missile fields, and this particular missile is based far in Russia's east, inside the Kamchatka Peninsula. The missile is already resting in an erected launch configuration, so it only takes a crew a few minutes to authenticate the order and make last-minute preparations for launch. When everything's ready to go, the launch order is given by the senior launch officer as the crew seeks shelter behind a rocky outcropping in case the aging missile experiences a launch failure. Russia's nuclear arsenal is getting into ever-worsening disrepair as the years go by, and the Russian Federation tries to live up to the old glory of the Soviet Union. Launch. The cone at the top of the Topol-M container is blown off by a series of small explosive charges. Then the massive missile roars to life. The solid-fuel rocket shudders as its engine comes online and lifts the 104,000-pound missile into the sky. Even as it's lifting off, the missile's guidance computer begins to connect to Russia's GLONASS satellite network. It's guided by both the inertial guidance and GLONASS satellite uplink, giving it some of the greatest precision of any missiles in the Russian arsenal. Uplink to GLONASS is critical, as the Topol-M isn't targeting a major city, which it could achieve with fair but not precision accuracy with only its inertial guidance systems. Instead, the Russian nuclear missile is targeting an American carrier strike group currently in transit south of Japan. Russia aims to teach the US a lesson with the only weapon it can effectively bring to bear against its military superpower. 15 seconds after launch. Just 15 seconds after launch, a satellite belonging to the United States space-based infrared system detects the massive thermal signature of a large rocket lifting off into the sky. U.S. early warning satellites have been extremely good at detecting missile launches and have even been used to track the launch of much smaller cruise missiles in Russia's conflicts in Ukraine and Syria. The massive Topol-M rocket lights up the early warning satellite's thermal sensor like a blowtorch in the middle of a blizzard. The satellite immediately links up with multiple American Milstar satellites and sends a flash alert to the 2nd Space Warning Squadron at Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado, as well as other units across the entire web of the U.S. missile defense. 25 seconds after launch. Punching through cloud cover, the eyes of multiple American early warning satellites are picking up the telltale thermal plume of a massive intercontinental ballistic missile. Internally, the satellites compare the thermal plume and other telemetry, such as speed, to positively identify the Russian missile as a Topol-M. 30 seconds after launch. The Russian missile is now entering the upper atmosphere in a highly inclined trajectory. To watching satellites, this is indicative of a strike somewhere far closer to Russian shores than the American homeland. The missile is also moving in the wrong direction for a strike in the US, as in that case it should be moving north to fly over the Arctic Circle. 1 minute 15 seconds after launch. The President of the United States has been made aware of the missile launch. America's space-based surveillance network confirms no additional launches. New telemetry also confirms that this missile is not being fired toward the American homeland. There is hope that this is simply a show of strength, an unannounced missile test with a dummy payload. However, the trajectory of the missile leaves Japan and the US base in Guam under threat. 1 minute 45 seconds after launch. An emergency alert is broadcast via Milstar satellites to every combat command and deployed carrier strike group around the world. Ballistic missile defenses are activated in Japan and Guam, as the Japanese Prime Minister is being alerted to the threat. However, the missile's trajectory makes it very unlikely that a strike is incoming toward the Japanese islands. Guam is a suspected target, but so is a transient carrier strike group, even now crossing south of Japan toward the South China Sea for routine freedom of navigation exercises. If the strike is against the U.S. carrier, there are only minutes for it to prepare to defend itself against a nuclear attack. 2 minutes 33 seconds after launch. The gravity of the threat has been relayed to the transiting American carrier and her escorts. Orders are immediately given for the ships in the formation to begin to spread out and put even more distance than normal between themselves. This is so that a strike against the group may damage most of the ships, but actually only sink a few. 3 minutes after launch. Jets are ordered to be cleared from the deck of the carrier and rushed below. It's a lengthy process to move a combat aircraft from the deck of a carrier to below decks via the massive aircraft elevators, and unlikely that more than 1 or 2 planes could be successfully transferred from a busy deck to below. But all attempts to minimize loss of personnel and all valuable aircraft must be made. Any non-essential crew to the current threat is ordered to brace. Damage control teams are ordered to begin to assemble. Even a glancing blow will likely still cause significant damage to the ship. 3 minutes 22 seconds after launch. The carrier's Aegis-equipped missile cruiser begins preparations for a ballistic missile defense. Its powerful Spy-1 radar begins sweeping the skies above for the incoming threat, though for now the missile is still far outside of its detection capabilities. 6 minutes 41 seconds after launch. Nearly 7 minutes after launch, the Tupolev missile separates the warhead delivery vehicle from the tree-stage rocket. This now splits open in a cloud of chaff meant to confuse American radar, and 4 warheads are jettisoned. Only one of the warheads is real. The other 3 are cleverly designed decoys meant to lure in interceptors and allow the real warhead to hit its target. The Russian missile has been experiencing some difficulties to date, however. American electronic attacks against the GLONASS system as well as space-based radar satellites have forced the missile to rely largely on inertial guidance as it makes its way to the last known location of the carrier strike group. Given that the carrier now has increased to its classified top speed, estimated to be well over 30 knots, this missile's accuracy is decreasing by the minute. 6 minutes 43 seconds after launch. American space-based satellites blast the cloud of chaff hiding the 3 decoys and 1 real warhead with high-powered radar, as powerful computers crunch through the data to work to reduce the effect of electronic noise created by the highly reflective chaff. In a few seconds, they have the telltale signature of at least 4 warheads. Using classified sensor technologies, the American satellites attempt to discern the real warhead from the fakes by measuring very subtle variations in the 4 warheads. Luckily, the Aegis missile defense cruiser waiting below has numerous interceptors ready to defend the strike group. But time will be of the essence, and the task of intercepting a ballistic missile is still incredibly difficult. In testing under realistic conditions, U.S. missile defenses have had a spotty record to date. Another spot on that record today will mean the death of thousands and the loss of over $15 billion in military hardware. 8 minutes 33 seconds after launch. The warheads have only a short flight time in space due to the proximity of the launcher versus its target, which is adding to the difficulty in interception. Data is of the greatest importance in successful missile interception, and gathering data takes time which is officially about to run out. The warheads begin their terminal descent down into the atmosphere. The Aegis cruiser's powerful Spy-1 radar lights them up from below. On the ship's deck, multiple SM-6 missiles fire off into the pre-dawn sky. A few seconds later, a second volley of missiles lights up, followed a few seconds later by yet a third. The cruiser is taking 0 chances and maximizing its odds of successful interception with multiple volleys. If they fail, thousands of sailors will die. 9 minutes 55 seconds after launch. The ship's AN/SPG-62 X-band radar illuminates the incoming warheads and helps provide terminal guidance to the SM-6 interceptors. The ability to directly network with both seaborne and space-based sensors allowed the Aegis cruiser to cut through most of the electronic noise caused by the massive cloud of chaff released as a countermeasure. There are still doubts about which warhead is the real target, and thus each warhead is assigned multiple interceptors. This increases the chances of targeting the right warhead, but reduces the chances of successfully intercepting it. The crew holds its breath as the incoming tracks quickly merge with the ship's defenses. 10 minutes 5 seconds after launch. Closing in at a speed of 1,700 meters a second, the first wave of interceptors managed to knock out one of the decoys with a near hit by the SM-6's explosive fragmentation warhead. The warhead suffers severe structural damage from the shrapnel and explosion and tumbles out of control at thousands of miles an hour, destroying itself in the lower atmosphere. 10 minutes 9 seconds after launch. The second volley of SM-6 missiles failed to hit a single target. 10 minutes 13 seconds after launch. The third volley of interceptors knock out a second dummy warhead. 10 minutes 15 seconds after launch. 60 miles below the 2 incoming warheads, there is no way for the strike group's crews to know if they've knocked out a real warhead or only dummies. Orders have already been given for all to brace for impact, and damage control crews are on standby to immediately pounce on any fires or see to fixing hull breaches and flooding. 10 minutes 20 seconds after launch. A massive fireball explodes 3,000 meters above the sea somewhere south of Japan. The massive explosion sends out a wave of electromagnetic and thermal radiation that temporarily overpowers satellite sensors. Gradually, the noise fades and these electronic eyes in the sky begin to frantically scan for signs of the strike group. The strike has been off by just over a mile, meaning that the carrier strike group has avoided the most lethal part of the nuclear attack. However, a massive pressure wave slams into the strike group and causes moderate structural damage. On the big carrier, most of the planes left on the deck, even those secured by tie-downs, are blown off and into the ocean by the hurricane gale winds smashing into the strike group. With crews ordered below decks, the initial release of radiation is largely harmless to the strike group's personnel. This is helped by the fact that the strike group was just outside the most lethal radius of the nuclear explosion. Despite this, numerous crew are killed across the strike group from the effect of the pressure wave. Several of the ships are flooding, but damage control crews are already on their way to enact repairs. Compartments too damaged for effective flood control are simply sealed off to keep the rest of the ship from also flooding. This dooms several sailors to a drowning death, as their comrades make the impossible choice of trapping them inside flooding sections in order to save the ship. The Russian nuclear strike has effectively rendered an entire strike group combat ineffective, as the ships must now limp to the nearest friendly port for immediate repairs. Decontamination must also be undertaken even before the ships arrive at port, and damage to the flight deck of the carrier repaired to make air operations impossible. However, things could have been far worse if Russia had used more than one missile, as they would in a serious attempt at sinking an American carrier and her accompanying escorts. The fact that Russian nuclear command and control systems, as well as their space surveillance and guidance, and even the missiles themselves are in great disrepair, helped limit possible damage as well. Russian guidance networks such as GLONASS are very vulnerable to disruption, making Russian weapons far from precise. Despite only suffering moderate damage, however, Russia has just launched a nuclear weapon against the armed forces of the United States of America. A full NATO Article 5 response is now inevitable, as is a state of war against a greatly outmatched Russian Federation. Faced with the certainty of losing a war against superior NATO forces, President Vladimir Putin must now contemplate expanding the use of nuclear weapons to defend his hold on power inside the Kremlin and fend off NATO attacks. Yet in the American White House, the President of the United States is now even reviewing options for a similar attack against a Russian military facility. The world stands on the brink of full-scale nuclear war in what might be the greatest and final conflict of the human race. A NATO airborne early warning aircraft flies slow, lazy patrols over the northern Polish border. Suddenly, at a distance of several hundred miles, it picks up the unmistakable radar return of a Russian fighter. The aircraft is closing fast at supersonic speeds, which puts it only minutes away from getting a good weapons lock on the big AWACS aircraft. The plane immediately banks and turns to put distance between itself and the Russian fighter. Simultaneously, an alert is issued to Poland's air defense network. A patrol of American F-15s have been in the air for 3 hours, flying a deterrent patrol, and are immediately vectored in. An alarm is sounded in the alert lounge of a Polish aircrew station on standby, and the 2 pilots rush to strap on their flight gear as the F-16s are prepped for flight. Since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Poland has kept aircrews on alert just in case of further Russian aggression. Meanwhile, the F-16's wing pylons are loaded with live air-to-air missiles. Within minutes, the pilots are climbing into their F-16s and screaming into the sky, ready to support their American allies. Thousands of feet in the sky and over 100 miles to the north, the big American F-15s are now picking up the unknown contact, presumed to be Russian, on their own radars. The F-15s are speeding toward the unknown contact, gaining airspeed so as to retain the advantage should this turn into a hostile encounter. The Russians have the distance advantage, with the R-77 Beyond Visual Range missile exceeding the range of the American AIM-120s by about 10 miles. However, the American fighters have better sensors, ensuring a higher probability of a kill, even if doing so requires putting themselves inside the kill envelope of the Russian fighter. There's a chance the Russian fighter is armed with R-37Ms with a range of over 300 kilometers. In that case, the F-15s will be well inside the Russian threat envelope in minutes, though the missiles are primarily meant to target less maneuverable aircraft such as the AWACS and tankers. The nimble F-15s would be a hard kill for the bulky R-37Ms. On the ground, the NATO AWACS plane sends targeting data to Patriot batteries stationed toward the north of Poland. While the Russian fighter is not yet within range of high-resolution targeting radar, the ability to link up with airborne assets makes Patriot air defense batteries deadly to interloping aircraft, even at long ranges. Soon, Poland's Aegis Ashore facility will be online and bring the same powerful tracking and targeting capabilities of the most advanced Aegis systems to ground-based air defenses. However, the facility is not yet complete after 4 years of construction delays. As a very likely target for Russian air or missile strikes, though, it is well protected by a ring of air defenses just in case the Russians seek to neutralize the multi-million-dollar facility before it's online and able to defend itself. The intercepting F-15s attempt radio contact with the Russian fighter, which is now identified as a Su-35, one of Russia's more capable fighters. The American Air Patrol warns the Su-35 that it's approaching Polish airspace and that it must turn back before crossing. The The situation is tense, but not overly so. Russia is fond of pushing NATO's buttons by coming close to but not actually crossing into NATO airspace. In the Baltics, though, where NATO forces are weaker, Russian aircraft will occasionally and briefly cross into NATO airspace, only to shortly exit soon after. It's a common provocation that's picked up intensity over the last decades as relations between Russia and NATO have deteriorated. Using afterburners, the Polish F-16s are now in a position to support the American allies if necessary, though the plane seems to be taking no hostile actions. Its altitude and speed remain steady around 32,000 feet. If it was truly preparing to threaten the American F-15s, it would climb for altitude in order to give its missiles a height and speed advantage. Where the atmosphere is thinner, air-to-air missiles can travel faster for longer due to a lack of air resistance. Plus, once their fuel is spent, they can pounce on targets below, building additional speed from their downward trajectory. That's why in air-to-air engagements, modern missiles first perform steep upward climbs, gaining thousands of feet in altitude versus their targets before pouncing on them from above. The F-15s make it clear they mean business by climbing altitude, though the Russian plane remains on course. There's no response in their radio hails. Again, this is fairly routine. For now, the Russian Su-35 is in Belarusian airspace. After the war in Ukraine began, Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko has allowed Russia to base pretty much any forces it wanted inside the former Soviet Republic. This has dramatically increased the frequency of air encounters between NATO and Russian air forces near Poland's northeast border. Though rare, NATO has even shadowed Russian aircraft flying strike missions into northwest Ukraine from just across the border. As the distance to the Polish border shrinks, the F-15s change their course, turning their noses toward the Su-35. This lets the Russians know that the Americans are looking straight down the barrel at them in an optimal targeting angle for their electronically scanned array radars, which guide missiles to their target. While the F-15's radars can still guide missiles to target at a variety of angles, the head-on angle is optimal and lets the Russians know that the Americans aren't messing around. Any sign of hostility will be met with immediate and lethal force. Now with the airspeed and height advantage, and well within the threat envelope of the Eagle's AIM-120's AMRAAMs, the Russian Su-35 is in dire straits if it decides it wants to pick a fight. To make matters worse, ground-based air defenses are now in the game. Patriot air defense batteries use their powerful AN/MPQ-65 radars to track and target the Russian fighter. The big phased array radar provides the Patriot system with classified range, believed to be in excess of 100 kilometers. It's a formidable air defense radar that uses a second traveling wave tube to boost the strength of the signal. This makes the AN/MPQ-65 difficult to jam or spoof, even at a long range. The attack network to the U.S. military's Link 16 command and control network allows the Patriot battery to share information with a vast array of U.S. assets. Software upgrades throughout the 2000s and 2010s give the Patriot a greater capability to conduct TBM, or theater ballistic missile searches, a necessity spurred on by the growing danger from long-range ballistic missiles fielded by both Russia and China. The system can also engage targets at predetermined altitudes so as to neutralize the effects of chemical weapons or early-release submunitions, which would otherwise be released across a wide area. The combination of software and radar is even able to tell if a contact is manned or unmanned, and if incoming ballistic objects re-entering the atmosphere are carrying ordnance or not. This makes the Patriot capable of resisting at least some of the most common countermeasures employed by ballistic missiles, such as releasing dummy warheads to lure in intercepting missiles. What makes the Patriot system work, however, is the PAC-2 and PAC-3 missiles. The PAC-3 missiles are the newest iteration of Patriot air defense missiles, but designed almost solely for the interception of ballistic missiles. The PAC-3 missile is slower and has a smaller range than the PAC-2, as it's intended to destroy ballistic missiles in their terminal phase. They also employ a hit-to-kill kinetic warhead armed with active radar that can be disconnected from ground stations and guide itself to a target, being smart enough to target the warhead portion of the missile. The kinetic kill warhead does employ a small explosive charge called a lethality enhancer, which launches 24 tungsten fragments in a radial direction to enhance kill probability. This makes the PAC-3 a much more sophisticated missile than the PAC-2, but also gives it extremely poor capabilities against a fast-flying and agile enemy fighter like the incoming Su-35. That's why Patriot batteries carry a mix of missiles, and it's the PAC-2's job to destroy incoming aircraft, which might threaten the Patriot battery itself. To do this, the PAC-2 employs a large fragmentation warhead, which is designed to shred enemy aircraft. A direct hit is not required to neutralize a fighter jet or a bomber, as these delicate machines require thousands of precisely engineered parts, all working perfectly to stay in the air. Damage to even some of these systems can be lethal to the aircraft, and the PAC-2 creates a vast cloud of high-speed shrapnel that shreds even the most armored enemy plane. In a wartime situation, a firing solution would have already been achieved, and the incoming Russian Su-35 would be facing threats from both airborne and ground-based missiles. But NATO and Russia are not at war yet. Thus, the F-15 pilots are told not to engage unless they themselves are engaged, and instead are directed to intercept the Russian plane within visual range. It's a show of force with the F-15s placing themselves between the Su-35 and any further penetration into Polish territory. As expected, the Su-35 briefly crosses into Polish airspace, is met by the American F-15s, but doesn't push its luck and quickly turns its nose parallel to the F-15s. After a few minutes, the Russian fighter once more turns back for safe airspace, leaving the F-15s to loiter near the border and watch from a distance. It's yet another microaggression by Russia meant to simply show NATO that it's not afraid of it, though it very much should be. Russia's aging air fleet puts it in serious doubt that it could actually threaten NATO airspace in any significant manner, and the current sanctions against Russia has left it unable to procure the more sophisticated electronic components it relied on for producing its air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles. This means that as the war in Ukraine rages on, Russian stockpiles of weapons diminish daily, and it couldn't possibly hope to compete against the vast quantities of missiles NATO still holds in reserve. It's a possibility that NATO is eyeing war as an increasing likelihood given the invasion of Ukraine. What was once thought impossible is now at the forefront of every member of NATO. Could Russia really declare war on the alliance? And could it win? To answer the question, we have to imagine an alternate timeline where Russian forces weren't bogged down in a never-ending fight for Ukraine, and instead opted for a more direct provocation against NATO. February 24, 2022, Russian forces have been involved in a large-scale exercise with their allies in Belarus, but this has been a front to allow Russian forces to stage closer to the NATO countries of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. At 0600 local Moscow time, Russian autocrat Vladimir Putin releases a pre-recorded message relaying his intention to declare a special military operation meant to bring NATO aggression to heel. Right on cue, Russian missile strikes begin to rain down across Lithuania and Latvia. The first targets are military bases and airfields. The attack isn't a complete surprise to NATO, though, and the missile defense systems begin to knock Russian missiles out of the air. The Russian volley is overwhelming, and with a hit rate of 60%, missile strikes saturate military targets across the Baltic nations. Dozens of NATO's forward-deployed supply caches are destroyed, along with several key supply depots. Russia's long-range targeting capabilities, however, are deficient due to the 2014 sanctions against it and the banning of dual-use technology that crippled its space surveillance network. While many missiles hit their targets, many don't, often hitting civilian targets instead. After a blistering barrage lasting half an hour, Russia has failed to completely cripple the command and control or air defense networks of the two countries, and over half of the airfields remain operational. In the air, Russian planes piggyback on the missile assault. Thanks to NATO's superior long-range surveillance capability, its air forces are not caught completely off guard, and several combat air patrols have been on constant rotation ever since the military buildup along Russia's western military district and Belarus. But the incoming wave of air power is overwhelming for the few defenders in the sky, and from damaged airfields across the Baltics, NATO fighters are being rushed for combat. Their pilots, however, have to be recalled to base from their home or barracks, adding to the response time. The few fighters NATO manages to get in the air engage Russian targets with standoff attack long-range air-to-air missiles. These missiles allow NATO forces to operate from well outside the envelope of Russian ground-based air defenses, which ring the Baltic states. The first combat casualties of the Russian-NATO war are Russian planes, but there are too few defenders and too many attackers to significantly stem the incoming air attack. With long-range missiles expended, NATO fighters are forced to move to positions just outside the threat range of the Russian S-400s and other mobile air defenses. Engaging Russian forces sent to neutralize them until forced to retreat to airfields in Latvia. With the missile onslaught and Russian air defenses in Kaliningrad on Lithuania's southern border, any surviving NATO aircraft can only be guaranteed some measure of safety further north in Latvia. But NATO has plenty of air defenses left operational, even after the opening missile barrage. In our real world, Russia proved unable to neutralize Ukraine's air defenses in its opening wave of attacks, despite having far superior air and long-range striking power. In this scenario, Russia's committing far more forces to the attack, but also facing far more sophisticated and better-equipped defenses. As Russian planes are blotted out of the sky by air defenses, the Russian air offensive is briefly halted. Instead, more limited strikes against air defense networks are carried out by long-range standoff weapons. However, Russia has a limited availability of smart weapons, and its targeting capabilities are far inferior to NATO. Many air defense sites are destroyed or heavily damaged, with anti-radiation missiles taking out all important air defense radars, but defenses on the more western parts of the Baltics remain intact. Within minutes of hostilities, NATO's Very High Readiness Response Force has been activated. Soldiers on leave or at home are being recalled, and a 5,000-strong response force of special forces, infantry, armor, and artillery is being assembled for immediate deployment. Within 48 hours, they'll be on the ground in the Baltics, ready to help stem the Russian onslaught. A few days later, they could be joined by NATO's response force, a rapid response force of 40,000 that includes combat air power and air support components. NATO maintains a contingent of around 1,000 strong of forward-deployed forces in the Baltics, and with the military buildup by Russia in recent weeks, this has been strengthened by an additional few thousand, along with several dozen aircraft. However, this is far insufficient to stop a Russian onslaught of 150,000 troops, even with Latvia and Lithuania's approximately 50,000 strong military. Of that number, not all are actual combat troops, with many being support and logistical personnel, so NATO's actual combat power in the ground numbers at barely over 12,000. Of more critical concern is the lack of tanks, though Latvia and Lithuania both field nearly 1,000 armored vehicles with some anti-tank capabilities. As Russian troops cross the border, NATO forces are ordered to retreat rather than engage the invaders. NATO's top general, Supreme Allied Commander General Todd D. Walters, is aware of the massive mismatch of forces across the Baltics. This exact scenario has been war-gamed extensively, and the only chance NATO has of holding off the Russian military long enough for its response force to arrive is to force the Russians into fighting in major cities where the terrain favors the defender and Russia's overwhelming firepower can be largely neutered. However, it's always been accepted that it was strategically impossible to guarantee the security of the Baltic members of NATO, given that stationing enough troops to do so would have required massive commitments of forward-deployed soldiers from across the alliance, a costly proposition, and a hugely destabilizing move that would have guaranteed a conflict between Russia and NATO much sooner than this. NATO will fight as best it can to hold the Baltics open for as long as possible, but its main response force already has plans to launch a counterattack from Poland, planning for the fall of Latvia and Lithuania within the first few days of fighting. Already, Polish troops are digging in for an assault, either from Kaliningrad or Belarus, but such an assault won't be forthcoming. Russia's strategy to break NATO is to target the relatively undefended Baltic states, and then simply dig in. NATO will then have to decide if it wants to invoke Article 5 of the Alliance's charter, stating that an attack on one is an attack on all, knowing that they'll be fighting an offensive war against an entrenched enemy in a conflict that could turn nuclear. Russia is betting that NATO's resolve is weak and it won't risk escalating the war. The assurance of mutual defense is a bedrock principle of NATO, and should it fail, the alliance could be splintered. The United States, Poland, and the United Kingdom are staunchly committed to invoking Article 5 in any case of hostilities, but other member nations might not be as committed to waging war for countries that many of them weren't happy about joining NATO anyway. Some of them, like Germany, have deep financial ties to Russia already, and an end to Russian energy for Germany will be economically catastrophic. Only the coming days will determine if NATO invokes Article 5 in full. But for now, what is sure is that even if Russia is facing just Poland, the UK, and the US, it's still facing a significantly powerful force. The US just has to get its firepower to Europe first, a process that will take weeks to fully mature. In our fictional scenario, though, the US hasn't been blind to Russia's buildup of forces along its western military district and in Belarus. In this scenario, an invasion of Ukraine was possible, but the buildup of forces and supply depots along the borders with the Baltic states tipped Russia's hand weeks ago. Still, the US has delayed in deploying the bulk of its firepower to Europe in hopes of not destabilizing the situation further. But that doesn't mean it hasn't taken steps to move a significant force to its bases in Germany. A large contingent of its air power has also been moved to bases in mainland Europe and the UK, and is now preparing for combat with the Russian Air Force. This has been a conflict the US Air Force has been waiting for a very long time. Its F-15 Fighting Eagle was designed to kill Soviet MiGs, but today it's more than capable of sweeping the skies clear of Russian fighters. The US's F-35 fleet isn't fully operational yet, but dozens of the advanced stealthy planes are ready for combat, and as the Russians will soon find out, are absolutely game-changing. NATO's strategy is simple. Draw the Russians into NATO territory and away from their logistics hubs inside Russia and Belarus. Logistics has always been the Russian military's weakest point, and in our real world, a lack of logistical support has severely affected the Russian military's ability to fight in Ukraine. This is because Russian forces are simply not capable by design of fighting major land offensives far from their own borders. This sounds strange, given that Russia's greatest potential conflict was a major land war in Europe, so it seems like it should be something that the Russian military would be prepared for. Yet, for all the focus on new hypersonic missiles, overwhelming amounts of artillery, thousands of tanks and APCs, etc., the Russian military has failed to learn the lesson it's been forcibly taught over and over again throughout history. A military can't fight without fuel, food, and ammo. Russian logistics focus on rail transportation with an incredible capability to move troops and equipment within their own borders quickly and efficiently. Russian internal logistics are probably some of the best in the world, and they even have an entire corps dedicated to railway transportation, its building, repairing, and maintenance. But Russian railways stop at the Soviet Union's old borders. That's because Russia uses a wider gauge railroad track than the rest of Europe, meaning that their plan to resupply forces via railroads stop at the Baltics in Ukraine. Adjustable carriages do exist, but engines cannot be made adjustable to fit both the Soviet rails and newer European rails. Thus, Russia would have to seize European engines to drive their railroad carriages into Europe proper. But NATO would never allow those engines to fall into the hands of the Russians for this exact reason. But whether delivering supplies to a railhead their trains can actually reach, or deeper into Europe with seized European engines, Russia still has a serious problem with logistics. Mainly, there aren't enough logistics personnel or equipment for the job of supplying all of its forces. Each Russian combined arms army is allotted a single material technical support brigade. Each material technical support brigade has 2 truck battalions with a total of 150 general cargo trucks with 50 trailers and 260 specialized trucks per brigade. The further an army moves from the railhead, the less trips that its resupply trucks can undertake, increasing the total length of time for resupply. At the current number of trucks available, there are simply not enough trucks for the operation more than a few dozen miles from a railhead, and that's before taking into account losses due to enemy activity and equipment breakdown. Take, for instance, Russia's heavy use of rocket artillery. Each Russian army has approximately 56 to 90 multiple launch rocket systems, and resupplying a single launcher takes up the entire bed of a truck. So if the entire MLRS force fired just one volley, it would require up to 90 trucks solely for resupplying ammunition. Those trucks then could not be used for anything else, like, for example, ferrying the fuel the MLRS needs to drive to a new location, or food or water or ammunition for the men manning the systems. Just a Russian army MLRS attachment is already taking up a significant amount of Russia's logistical capabilities, leaving the rest of its forces, tanks, APCs, infantry, tube artillery, with much fewer trucks for their own resupply needs. And again, this is before taking into account the fact that Russian logistics will be under constant enemy attack, or that resupplies further diminish the further from a safe railhead the Russian offensive moves. In our hypothetical scenario, NATO understands this all too well, and that's why, as their forces retreat to pull the Russians deeper into NATO territory, Special Operations Forces launch raids against Russian supply convoys before melting back into the countryside. NATO's strategy is to put up a mobile defense that keeps the Russians firing and burning gas, but places a tactical victory always just out of their grasp. Russian units are equipped to be independent of resupply for 3 to 5 days, but in intense urban combat, those figures shrink dramatically to just 3 days at best. By the dawn of the 4th day of fighting, Russian forces are forced to cease their advance toward Riga, starved of ammunition, food, water, and fuel. In Lithuania, though, they have managed to capture Vilnius, though partisan fighters are making the Russians suffer in street-to-street fighting. With superior reconnaissance capabilities, NATO was able to pinpoint Russian air defenses and send Wild Weasel aircrafts on a mission to destroy them. Taking from the example of Russian performance in Ukraine today, these suppression of enemy air defense missions succeed with astounding success. For longer-range S-400 and older S-300 batteries, F-35s equipped with glide bombs are able to overwhelm their missile defenses and destroy them without the S-400 ever getting off a single shot. Loitering MiGs defending from air attack are likewise unable to pick off the F-35s until they get to within close range, which very few manage to do without getting blown out of the sky. However, the number of F-35s is limited, which is where their capability to network with non-stealthy 4th-generation planes comes into play. With their advanced data links, F-35s are able to guide target bombs and missiles fired by non-stealthy planes who can carry out attacks far outside the threat envelope of Russian defenses. The results are devastating, and though a dozen F-35s are lost in combat, Russian air defenses are savagely mauled. The greatest factor of NATO's success, however, is Russia's own incompetence. Our real-world invasion of Ukraine has proven that the modern Russian military is nowhere near the formidable beast that Europe has feared. In fact, they're barely capable of carrying out modern combat operations, and it's only their overwhelming numbers that are seeing them slowly defeat Ukraine's forces. On the tactical level, we've seen time and again as Russian tank commanders don't make use of dismounted infantry to protect the tanks from anti-tank kill teams, leading to numerous deadly ambushes by Ukrainian forces using NATO anti-tank missiles. We've also seen as Russian forces practice no discernible convoy security procedures, with their convoys often coming to a complete stop at crossroads and other danger crossings, and without deploying security elements on their flanks to delay an enemy attack and allow the convoy to push through. Even their ability to prevent friendly fire incidents through discipline and communications is under question, as more than once, Russian units have engaged in full-blown battles between each other, much to the observing Ukrainians' delight. Perhaps most baffling of all is the destruction of Russian air defenses inside a convoy by Ukrainian aircraft, even when at a complete stop for several hours. Their Russian crews never bothered to turn on their radar and scan for threats. The scenario has also repeated itself numerous times. Lastly, we've seen time and again how Russian forces fail to properly respond to Ukrainian ambushes. When caught in an ambush, the proper procedure is to either fight out of the ambush or assault through it. Instead, Russian forces are often seen scattering in a panic, while their comrades who stayed behind actually to assault the ambush are obliterated one by one. Forces outside of the ambush zone are commonly observed to either drive away in a panic or come to a complete stop and begin to back up. Instead, forces outside of an ambush should be deploying for a flanking assault on the ambushing enemy force, neutralizing the threat to their comrades stuck in the kill zone. All we've seen so far in Ukraine is indicative of one thing: the Russian military is largely poorly trained. But they're also operating equipment in various stages of disrepair. Some units enjoy more modern, well-maintained equipment and are appropriately deadly, but many others seem to be suffering from serious maintenance and modernity problems. Russian tanks, for instance, are being savaged by Ukrainian infantry armed with anti-tank missiles, not just because of poor tactics in their deployment, but also because they lack active protection systems such as Trophy, which an increasing number of U.S. combat vehicles are equipped with. They seem to also lack environmental sensors to help them pinpoint the source of the attack, leading to confusion and panic after an attack, only made worse by poor discipline, training, and ever-shrinking morale. Often vaunted for its electronic warfare capabilities, the Russian military has proven itself incapable of securing its own communications in its invasion of Ukraine. As it turns out, an astonishing number of Russian units operate on completely unsecured radios. This has allowed the Ukrainian military and even amateur radio operators to interfere with and jam Russian radios. Ukrainians have hopped onto Russian frequencies to insult their invaders, play the Ukrainian national anthem on repeat for days at a time, and even jammed the frequency with white noise, revealing messages or images when analyzed digitally. Against NATO, unsecured communications spell disaster for the Russian military, as NATO electronic warfare operatives don't just jam Russian communications, but actively use them for sabotage. False orders are relayed over unsecured radios, causing entire Russian units to move out of formation or even launch attacks against phantom targets. Fluent Russian speakers wreak havoc on Russian forces simply by hijacking their unsecured comms. But because they must be very close to the front line to do so, their effectiveness is limited. As NATO's response force finally prepares for a proper engagement against Russian forces, their air forces launch a devastating assault from the air. American B-2 stealth bombers penetrate into Russian air defenses to destroy important communication hubs and surveillance radars, throwing air defenses into disarray. Much like in the First Gulf War, when Iraq used air defense networks modeled after Russia's own, these precision strikes by stealthy aircraft proved to be crippling for the air defense capabilities of Russian units. Add in serious resupply problems after constant missile and air attacks against Russian railways and strategically important bridges, and the Russian army's capability to defend itself in the air falls largely to its aerospace forces. But here too, NATO has the advantage. Russian pilots struggle to keep a 120-hour flight time minimum per year, while NATO pilots regularly fly nearly twice as many hours to maintain their proficiency. Maintenance problems also affect the Russian aerospace forces. In our real world, we saw 2 Russian aircraft simply fall out of the sky on the first day of Ukrainian invasion due to maintenance issues, and across the broader Russian Air Force we can expect similar levels of unreadiness. But it's better avionics, sensors, and longer-range anti-air missiles coupled with a sprinkling of F-35s that prove decisive in the sky. In the largest air battle since World War II, NATO forces wrestle control of the skies over the front away from the Russians, resulting in dozens of casualties on both sides. This opens up the greater use of air support to attack Russian army formations, though. And here again, another of NATO's strengths over Russia comes into play. Very few Russian pilots have multi-role experience, while NATO pilots regularly fly both air superiority and airstrike missions. For a NATO plane, switching from shooting down MiGs to blowing up tanks is as simple as switching the plane's munitions. But Russian air forces must use dedicated aircraft and crews for each mission. The lack of flexibility hurts Russian forces badly in Ukraine, especially in the opening days of the war. And this is why historically Russia relies heavily on artillery for fire support, not aircraft. Logistic problems have starved Russian artillery of ammunition, though, and even when fully supplied, Russian artillery is not very flexible. Needing to always stay under an umbrella of ground-based fire support has also significantly slowed Russia's advance, while NATO forces can better exploit tactical opportunities thanks to their reliance on air power for fire support. Now NATO is on the offensive on the ground, not just in the air, and the final critical weakness of the Russian military is revealed. NATO attacks Russian formations across multiple fronts with smaller but much more maneuverable forces. This exploits an inherent weakness of the Russian battalion tactical group. which is its inability to coordinate fire support against attacks coming from multiple directions. A lack of maneuver forces held in reserve also limits the Russian BTG's ability to respond to various new fronts at the same time. NATO's aggressive attacks across multiple fronts throws Russian commanders into disarray due to an inherent limitation in their command and control systems. Their electronic warfare and direct fire assets are formidable, but incapable of focusing across a wide front. By comparison, the decentralized command structure of NATO forces allows them to maneuver 3 times as many units simultaneously, with each formation acting semi-autonomously and pursuing objectives and opportunities as they arise. The result is like a giant trying to swat away hundreds of bees attacking simultaneously. Where Russian blows land, they're devastating, and numerous NATO units are annihilated in fierce close-quarter combat. But while one front is being reinforced, a completely different front is being attacked, causing confusion and chaos at the command level. NATO's own electronic warfare assets and fire support only add to the quickly gathering fog of war that the Russian chain of command is suddenly finding itself fighting in. As nighttime rolls around, though, things go from bad to worse for Russian forces. As observed in Ukraine, Russian night attack capabilities are uneven and sporadic. Many soldiers lack basic night vision, and NATO tanks and armored vehicles have on the whole more capable sensors and imagers. This allows NATO vehicles to open up first and from further away. American Abrams Silver bullets prove particularly deadly versus Russian armor, just like they did against Russian tanks in the First Gulf War. T-72s make up the bulk of Russian armor, and while domestic models are better protected than export models provided to Iraq, the results are largely the same. T-90s fare better against NATO's more modern tanks, but there's simply too few of them and the front is too wide. The vaunted T-14, which was supposed to revolutionize tank warfare, never made it to full-scale production thanks to sanctions against Russia and its sputtering economy. The fight is not bloodless for NATO forces, though, and casualties quickly climb into the thousands after days of fierce fighting, with hundreds of armored vehicles lost on both sides. However, NATO operational superiority, high morale, better training, and largely more capable equipment proves to be decisive. Perhaps more than anything else, though, it's Russia's logistics that doom its military offensive into the Baltics. NATO forces have been savagely attacking Russian supply convoys, even at the cost of foregoing attacks against tank and artillery positions. NATO knows it's far more important to disrupt Russia's ability to resupply its forces than to actually destroy said forces. And now with Russian troops deep in the Baltics and far from their rail network, their supply difficulties increase exponentially with each truck lost. The Russian military has been pressing civilian trucks into service, but ongoing attacks against supply convoys and even the destruction of public roads makes resupply increasingly impossible. By a week of proper ground fighting between the two sides, Russian troops are surrendering en masse and abandoning their vehicles. We saw this in our real world in Ukraine, and continue to see it as Russia struggles to fix its logistics problems. Ukrainian forces have discovered entire convoys of Russian tanks and APCs abandoned due to a lack of fuel or food, their crews trying to hike back to friendly lines. Against a far more capable force such as NATO, these logistical problems become critical vulnerabilities that spell disaster for the Russian military. It's the same story across every facet of the Russian military that has proven to be, in the words of the retired American Major General Paul Eaton, unexpectedly incompetent and incapable of combined arms warfare. Stalin had a famous adage when asked about the West's technological superiority: quantity is a quality all its own. That might have been true back in his day, but today no amount of quantity can make up for the Russian military's complete lack of basic fundamentals. While a NATO-Russian war would be devastating for both sides, in a non-nuclear scenario, Russia has proven in its bungled invasion of Ukraine that it has no hope of victory against the obviously superior North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For decades, Russia has been the world's second most powerful military. Today, it is the second most powerful military inside Ukraine. How in the world did a nation with such a significant military overmatch get into a quagmire against a much weaker power? Just what is wrong with the Russian military? The numbers speak for themselves. As of 30 days since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Russian military has lost a staggering 1,794 vehicles. Of these, 877 have been completely destroyed, 34 seriously damaged, 228 abandoned, and 655 captured by the Ukrainians. Compare that with 536 vehicles that Ukraine has lost, of which 205 were destroyed, 16 severely damaged, 37 abandoned, and 278 captured. And these are just the figures confirmed via international intelligence agencies and amateur sleuths using social media and satellite photographs. The real casualties are bound to be much higher. When it comes to personnel, the only official figure given by Russia's Ministry of Defense is a few hundred KIA. However, the real figure is estimated at between 10 to 15,000 dead, with many or more wounded, missing in action, or deserting. U.S. intelligence estimates that Russia is suffering an incomprehensible 1,000 casualties a day. Simply put, this makes victory in Ukraine impossible for Russia. So, what in the world is going on with an army every Western analyst had touted as the second best in the world and a near-peer competitor to the United States? The problems are numerous, but like all great tragedies, start out with the smallest things. Maintenance is something nobody likes doing. It's a downright pain for all involved, but preventative maintenance is vital for keeping the complex machinery of war working, and the United States military places a premium on it. There are rules, regulations, and all sorts of detailed checklists for everything from maintaining proper tire pressure in a vehicle to oil changes and probably even how to adjust your seat properly. But in Ukraine, Russia has shown with startling clarity what happens when you ignore even the most basic of maintenance. One of the most common images of the war is abandoned Russian vehicles littering the Ukrainian countryside by the hundreds. And while there's numerous reasons for this that we'll get into shortly, by far the dumbest is a simple failure by the Russians to turn their vehicles around once a month while in storage. Logistics and maintenance experts from Western armies were quick to spot the telltale signs of sun damage on many tires found flat on abandoned Russian vehicles, which let them know exactly how those tires got flat. As the sun beats down on a vehicle kept parked in storage, it weakens the rubber, which is why it's important to routinely rotate a parked vehicle so that the sun doesn't have a chance to break down the rubber on the sun-facing tires. Russians didn't do this, and inevitably, their multi-million-dollar vehicles ended up as scrap for Ukrainian farmers when they were forced to run them at low pressure through mud, and their tires popped. There's ample evidence of a failure to conduct even basic maintenance across hundreds of captured Russian vehicles, but tires once more betraying the Russian military for one reason: they're cheap. Russian vehicles appear to be equipped with Chinese military tires, specifically the Yellow Sea YS-20 tires, which, according to a former quality auditor of U.S. Army tactical vehicles, Trent Telenko, is a bad copy of the Michelin XCL military tire. The Chinese tires aren't rated to carry as heavy loads as the vehicles they've been placed on, and they're riddled with construction defects. While Western military tires are more expensive, they're also much higher quality and even undergo X-ray testing to ensure integrity. Chinese tires are not held to the same standards, and Russia has bought them by the thousands, ironically making things like $40 million air defense systems completely useless thanks to a few cheap tires. That's far from the only cheap equipment being fielded by Russian military, though, as it's become abundantly clear that the world's second most powerful army is a paper tiger, sometimes so literally it's frightening. Recently, Ukraine's National Agency on Corruption Prevention sent a thank you letter to the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, praising his efforts in ensuring high levels of corruption in the Russian military. Ukraine's discoveries have been nothing short of shocking. For example, tank explosive reactive armor is supposed to defend the vulnerable vehicles from anti-tank weapons fire, something that has been abundantly mauling Russia's armed forces. Yet, upon capturing several Russian tanks, the Ukrainians cut open the armor panels and discovered that instead of an armor package, the tanks were protected by egg cartons. But Russian soldiers haven't fared much better. On February 2nd, Russia unveiled its futuristic new Sotnik full body armor, allegedly capable of stopping a .50 caliber round. It's impressive. But in the real world, Russia's actual soldiers are protected once more by cardboard. Ukrainian forces have found time and time again that the plates inside a Russian body armor are nothing more than stiff cardboard. The Ukrainian NACP thanked the Russian defense minister for ensuring that Russian troops would be so easy to defeat, and advised that they include training for their soldiers on how to properly surrender to Ukrainian forces. So why are Russian soldiers going to war wearing cardboard body armor and in tanks protected by egg crates? When Vladimir Putin inherited the Russian military, it could barely keep its own ships afloat, and soldiers were wrapping their feet in cloth instead of wearing socks. For 2 decades, though, Putin has channeled hundreds of billions into modernizing the Russian military, prompting the New York Times on January 27, 2022 to write the following headline: Russia's military, once creaky, is modern and lethal. But they weren't the only ones to seriously misjudge the state of Russia's armed forces. In 2020, The Economist ran the headline, Russian military forces dazzle after a decade of reform, followed by the subheadline, NATO will need to step up. Over and over again, Western media and defense publications have been awash with tales of a resurgent Russia investing hundreds of billions into creating a modern lethal force. But the truth has been laid bare. Much of that money has obviously been siphoned off by individuals across the length and breadth of the Russian leadership and acquisition chains. Corruption is nothing new in Russia. Putin himself is likely the world's richest man thanks to all the wealth he's stolen from national industries and oligarchs he disliked. What is new is just how jaw-droppingly pervasive Russian corruption has been, stretching so far and gobbling up so much funding that Russian soldiers are using egg crate tank armor and cardboard armor inserts. Cheap Chinese tires show a further siphoning of funds, with untold millions pocketed by spending well under allotted procurement budgets. It's all but a certainty then that Russia's infamous maintenance problems aren't just a sign of bad leadership and poor standards, but also a result of the corruption that has eaten up funds meant for maintenance of equipment and procurement of quality replacement parts. We have evidence of this from the many reports of Russian armored vehicle crews scrounging through Ukrainian junkyards for replacement parts, which in at least one verified instance led to Ukrainians stealing other parts from a broken-down vehicle while its operators were themselves trying to steal parts from the Ukrainians. When they returned, they installed the stolen part and then realized they were missing other parts, and thus set off once more to raid the junkyard. Ukrainian citizens took that opportunity to steal back the original part in question and disappear with it. The vehicle was eventually abandoned, and Ukraine might have officially caused the first combat casualty of warfare through trolling. Ineptitude is yet another of the staggering number of problems affecting the Russian military. We have seen this at the highest lengths, with the Russian intelligence services completely failing to properly assess how Ukrainians would respond to an invasion, or how well prepared the military was to defend its homeland. Russia expected an easy victory, so easy in fact that on day one, Russia launched multiple air assaults just outside of Kyiv, expecting that it could simply create an air bridge by seizing runways and fly reinforcements in, with the capital falling within 3 days. Instead, the air assaults were almost all destroyed, inflicting horrible casualties on Russia's much-vaunted airborne forces. In Russia, its airborne forces are legendary and even enjoy an entire day dedicated to them, called Paratroopers Day. However, when put to the test, Russian paratroopers failed to achieve even one of their objectives in the opening days of the war, being thoroughly defeated by Ukraine's rapid response forces. It would be unfair to place all the blame on Russia's paratroopers, though. Truthfully, they were let down by the massive incompetence of Russian leadership, who believed lightly armed paratroopers could hold airports long enough for heavy vehicles to simply be flown in. This underestimated not just Ukrainian capabilities to respond to deep penetration air assaults, but also Ukrainian air defenses, which were still mostly active even weeks into the war and made reinforcing via air bridge impossible. The failure to shut down Ukraine's air defenses is another casualty of Russian incompetence, though this time it stretches all the way to the top. When the United States led a coalition in 1991 to end Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, it shut down Iraq's air defenses within 48 hours through surgical and overwhelming strikes, while fighter aircraft swept from the skies any Iraqi fighters foolish enough to resist. By comparison, Putin dedicated only a small portion of the vastly superior in number Russian Air Force to try to shoot down Ukraine's air defenses. What should have taken Russia a few days to accomplish has yet to materialize, and incredibly, a month into the fighting, Ukrainian Air Force is still largely intact and flying up to 5 sorties a day. It's believed that Putin did not want to dedicate the number of aircraft necessary to the task, as it would signal that his special military operation was in fact what it really is, a full-scale war. To maintain domestic support, Putin must keep up the facade that Russian forces are still engaged in only light fighting, and thanks to his massive control over Russian media, he's still somewhat succeeding at maintaining his narrative. But this has allowed Ukraine's air defenses to continue to take a heavy toll on the Russian aircraft, with 39 planes and 40 helicopters lost in just the first 2 weeks alone. The total number today after a month of fighting is unknown, but believed to be well over 100. Incompetence in the Russian military, however, extends all the way down the chain of command. Russian forces have to date shown little competency in everything from convoy security to responding to ambushes. In this video, we can see Russian armor bunched up inside of a neighborhood, and subsequently they fall prey to a well-coordinated ambush. Not only do the bunched up vehicles make easy targets, but the destruction or damaging of one vehicle can cause traffic jams as the panicked drivers try to get away. This is a failure of the proper way to use armor in combination with infantry. In the West, armor is always closely supported by infantry, whose job it is to protect the tank from enemy anti-tank teams. Not only should these vehicles not have been bunched up so closely together, they're lucky they weren't also under air or artillery attack. If the convoy had to stop for some reason, they should have been deploying infantry to screen the flanks against exactly this type of ambush. Yet, time and again, we see Russian troops failing to grasp even this most basic of combined arms concepts, and Russian armored vehicles are paying a staggering price for it, with nearly 2,000 combat losses. In yet another video, we see how Russian troops have been reacting to ambushes. In this video, we can see a column of Russian vehicles wander into Ukrainian ambush, with a vehicle taken out by an anti-tank team. The US military teaches that the best way to survive an ambush is to assault it by turning armored vehicles into the ambush so their thicker frontal plates are presented to the enemy, and deploying infantry to fire on and suppress the enemy. Forces outside of the kill zone can then launch an assault against the ambush's flanks. Instead, the Russian forces scatter in panic, with only 2 of the tanks turning to the ambush and returning fire. Forces outside of the ambush simply come to a dead stop, and no Russian infantry dismounts to assault the ambush and relieve pressure on their buddies in the kill zone. Tactical incompetence extends to pretty much every aspect of the Russian convoy security, though, as their convoys have been observed coming to full stops at intersections, an absolute no-no for any convoy. Then, when they eventually begin moving again, instead of deploying screening elements on either side of the intersection, the convoy simply pulls ahead in single file, leaving themselves wide open to enemy attack. Perhaps the most baffling of all, though, is the destruction of air defense equipment via airstrike within parked convoys, with the operators not bothering to turn on their air defense radars for hours while the convoy sat at a dead standstill. Russian troops are proving themselves to be poorly trained to the point of gross incompetence, but we couldn't mention convoys without explaining one of Russia's greatest failures to date. By now, everyone has seen images of an incredible 40-kilometer convoy of armored vehicles, fuel trucks, and artillery all stuck on its way to Kyiv, with similar scenes repeating themselves at a smaller scale throughout Ukraine. Just what in the world is going on with Russia's convoys? Incredibly, the answer is simple. They're out of gas. Even more incredibly, they still haven't solved the problem after 3 weeks. Initially, Russia's forces went into Ukraine with approximately 3 to 5 days of supplies and relied on their logistics fleets to keep them resupplied past that. The only problem is that Russia doesn't have enough trucks or logistics personnel to properly resupply its armed forces. Instead, the troops rely on railroads to haul supplies to the front, a task helped by Russia's very impressive rail logistics corps capable of building new railway, maintaining rails, and repairing them. The problem is Ukraine keeps blowing up those railways, and Russian troops can't seem to stop them. At this point, any hope of supplying forces inside of Ukraine via the shared railways between the two nations are a pipe dream. But you still need to get supplies from a railhead to where the combat is actually taking place, and Russia's lack of supply trucks makes this impossible in a meaningful way once an offensive has moved a few dozen miles out of friendly territory. Each Russian combined army is assigned a material technical support brigade, consisting of 2 truck battalions with a total of 150 general cargo trucks with 50 trailers and 260 specialized trucks per brigade. This gives Russia enough logistical capacity to resupply forces no further than 90 miles from a supply dump, as increasing distance lowers the number of trips each truck can make and adds further delay to full resupply. With forces now inside Ukraine's borders and far outside the range of supply depots safe behind enemy lines, resupply has become slow. But adding to Russia's problems is the fact that the Ukrainian forces are very good at finding Russian trucks and destroying them. In fact, Ukrainians have shown a preference for destroying trucks over armored vehicles and have a saying, "Tanks can't fight without resupply." With each lost truck, resupply takes even longer, leading to stalled-out offensives and an incredible 40-kilometer-long train of parked vehicles. But the general ineptitude of Russian leadership makes orderly resupply difficult, causing massive traffic snarls of their own creation and further miring Russian troops down. This lack of leadership highlights yet another of Russia's massive deficiencies: the complete lack of trained and disciplined non-commissioned officer corps. In the U.S. military, non-commissioned officers, or NCOs, make up the backbone of its armed forces. These are the men and women responsible for the everyday running and maintenance of the American military, and Russia lacks any similar capability. Thanks to its hierarchical nature, the Russian military has placed little emphasis on properly training a professional NCO corps, and now that it's facing its first modern foe, the military is suffering for it. While America places an emphasis on empowering its NCOs to make on-the-fly decisions and seize the initiative, the Russian military has no such leadership cadre, which inevitably leads to a need for senior officers to lead from the front. But senior officers are few in number and simply can't be as omnipresent as a wide cadre of NCOs can be, and even more importantly, are far too valuable to risk dying on the front lines, which is exactly what's been happening to Russia's majors, colonels, and even generals. As of this writing, 7 senior Russian generals are believed to have been killed in 1 month. By comparison, the United States lost 2 generals in 20 years of fighting the global war on terror. One was killed in the September 11th attack at the Pentagon, and the other was killed on August 5th, 2014, during an insider attack in Afghanistan. 0 of America's general officers have been killed on the front lines. Russian generals claim to simply lead from the front and take inspiration from Prince Peter Ivanovich Bagration, who was fatally wounded at the Battle of Borodino in 1812, or Generalissimo Alexander Suvorov, who always fought on the most exposed part of the front. However, the truth is that the Russian generals are having to fight at the front because they don't trust their subordinates to follow orders, and because of the complete breakdown of their communication abilities. Communications, though, is yet another of Russia's mind-boggling failures in its execution of this invasion. Once more, likely due to corruption, the world has learned that a significant amount of Russia's armed forces are operating on civilian-quality unsecured radios. Radio broadcasts between Russian units have been recorded by civilian observers using basic equipment, with some civilians taking the opportunities to simply jam Russian frequencies or troll them with the Ukrainian national anthem, the popular American Yankee Doodle song, or other random audio. Incredibly, even Russia's strategic bombers have have been recorded operating on completely open and unsecured radios. Not only has Ukrainian interruption of these unsecured communications caused massive problems for Russia's military, it's even led to strategic defeats of its forces. At least one Russian general has been killed after his position was pinpointed by listening in on these unsecured broadcasts. Ukrainian artillery has also been very successful in using these broadcasts to pinpoint Russian units and saturate them with fire. Perhaps most baffling of all, though, is the failure of Russia's highly secure cryptophone system. Introduced in 2021, ERA was touted as the most secure communication system in the world, capable of secure conversations from almost anywhere on the face of the planet. However, Russian generals and intelligence agents have been unable to use it inside of Ukraine. The reason? It relies on cell towers and uses 3G and 4G to communicate. And the Russians have destroyed most of the cell towers in the areas they've occupied. Hundreds of millions of dollars in research, development, and procurement costs all wasted on a system that can't work when the Russians need it the most, simply because somebody didn't tell the troops not to destroy the cell towers. Now, Russians are forced to use unencrypted landlines for highly sensitive conversations, which inevitably have been intercepted by Ukraine and Western intelligence agencies to great strategic effect. By now, you are no doubt fully aware of the extent of Russia's war crimes against Ukraine civilians, and this is yet because of another failure of the Russian military. Russia has a very low supply of smart weapons, both because it simply can't afford them due to 2014 sanctions, and because Russia's always placed a low priority on precision weapons. Most of its aircraft also lack targeting pods. Inevitably, it was feared that as Russia's stockpile of smart munitions dried up, it would resort to much more indiscriminate dumb bombs, resulting in high amounts of collateral damage and very little actual destruction of intended targets, Ukrainian military positions. This turned out to be the case within a week of the invasion. But the scale of assault on civilians has only increased exponentially since then. Why? Simply put, because the Russian military is really bad at war. They're so bad that they rely on mass slaughter of civilians to force a peace on their terms. They did this in Georgia, they did it in Chechnya, and they did it in Aleppo, killing thousands of civilians with indiscriminate bombing and artillery fire. Now they're doing it in Ukraine as their offensive bogs down due to a stiff Ukrainian resistance. Putin's strategy is simple: kill so many civilians that Zelensky is forced to accept a peace on Putin's terms, even though Putin is the one losing. This is the reason why Russia bombed a maternity hospital, killing pregnant women and their unborn children. It's the reason why they bombed a feeder, clearly marked with the word children on both the front and back yards. And it's the reason why their troops have been recorded opening fire on civilian vehicles and civilians standing in bread lines in videos too graphic for us to share with you here. They have even routinely attacked convoys of civilians fleeing conflict areas through humanitarian corridors that they established themselves, only to close them hours later and open fire on anyone stuck within them. Russia's strategy is to cause a humanitarian crisis so terrible, Zelensky will have to admit defeat even though, and we cannot stress this enough, Russia is losing this war. But Ukrainians aren't giving up, and Putin's terror campaign is backfiring, galvanizing an estimated 15,000 foreign volunteers to come to Ukraine's defense in just 1 month. Many of these are amateurs with little more than a willingness to help defend Ukraine, but many more of these are highly trained professionals from militaries all across the West who bring years of experience fighting in the Middle East to bear on incompetent Russian forces. As this invasion progresses, we'll learn more about the true vulnerabilities and deficiencies of the Russian war machine. But as of right now, it's clear Russia is no longer the second most powerful military in the world. In fact, they're only the second most powerful military inside Ukraine. The U.S. has sent nearly $30 billion worth of aid to Ukraine, with a significant chunk of that being military equipment. The equipment has directly supported the nation's stunning counterattack, with U.S. equipment taking center stage in shaping the battle before it was even launched. Russia is now finding out why the U.S. doesn't have free healthcare. But what equipment has the U.S. sent? And why does it seem like Russia is helpless against it? Javelin. A week after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was one name the Russian army and the rest of the world had become very familiar with: Javelin. This premier American anti-tank system first entered service in 1996 when it replaced the M47 Dragon and has proven absolutely lethal against Russian armor. This is the weapon U.S. infantry would have used themselves in a war with Russia, and its effectiveness is nothing short of terrifying. The weapon consists of two components: the launch tube assembly and the reusable command launch unit. The clue is the brains of the system and features 4 times magnification at both day and night with its thermal sight. This system allows U.S. infantry to no longer be reliant on supporting heavy vehicles for target identification, and the clue can be used by itself even when no more missiles are available to provide infantry with a portable and very capable thermal sight. A 12 times magnification narrow field of view option allows gunners to effectively zoom in on a target and properly identify it. When the gunner's ready to fire, he switches to a Seeker FOV mode at 9 times magnification. This is effectively now being fed into the missile guidance unit. With target selected, the gunner squeezes a second button and the missile is on its way to deliver 19 pounds of supersonic tandem charge high explosive American freedom to its target. In order to defeat modern reactive armor, the Javelin missile features 2 warheads that detonate in rapid succession. The first is a smaller charge, which is meant to blow away explosive reactive armor panels being fired up at the missile in an attempt to disrupt it. The second shaped charge creates a narrow stream of molten metal that penetrates through tank armor to deliver an extremely emotional event to the crew inside. When targeting armored vehicles, the Javelin switches to top attack mode, in which the missile fires straight up into the air and then comes down directly on the tank's thinner top armor. You've probably seen pictures of Russian tanks with what were termed cope cages. These metal cages were being welded onto Russian tanks at the start of the invasion to protect from anti-tank missiles, and in some cases could actually be effective. However, against modern anti-tank weapons, the cages were simply wasted labor, and as St. Javelin took a horrible toll on Russian tanks, the Russian Ministry of Defense quickly sought out a new solution. Nowadays, you're probably not seeing many of these cages on Russian tanks because A, most Russian tanks are now Ukrainian tanks, and B, they didn't work. So why are Javelins so effective against Russian armor? The truth is that modern anti-tank missiles of the quality being supplied to Ukraine are frankly terrifyingly effective. Even Western tanks would be hard put to defend themselves against them, which is why the US is gradually adding the trophy protection system to its own tanks. This anti-tank missile system fires explosive charges at incoming missiles that are more effective at disrupting the weapon than explosive reactive armor panels. However, the real reason why Javelins are pounding Russian armor into scrap metal is that Russia has very poor military doctrine and uses its tanks improperly. Tanks are not meant to operate on their own, but are rather meant to be directly supported by infantry. Supporting infantry forces are responsible for keeping enemy hunter-killer teams at bay. Yet, the Russian military has routinely shown that it does not operate armor and infantry together well at all. Often, Russian armor is simply left to fend for itself with predictable results. Kamikaze drones. Odds are you've now become familiar with the names Phoenix Ghost or Switchblade. Russian infantry is not only aware of the names but actively fears them. The Phoenix Ghost drone is a loitering munition developed under the US military's Big Safari weapons program. This acquisitions program is meant to rapidly deliver new weapons to meet unexpected or evolving threats, allowing the US military to quickly counter enemy capabilities using pre-existing technology rather than going through a whole development and testing cycle of new tech. To date, the US has sent around 700 of these weapons to Ukraine, with a significant impact on the battlefield. The loitering munitions can hover over an area for 6 hours and conduct surveillance at both night and day thanks to its infrared sensors. Once a target has been detected, the drone kamikazes down onto its head with an explosive finale. The drone is great for taking out entrenched infantry, or even lightly armored vehicles such as trucks. The Switchblade is the name most people are familiar with, and has sort of stolen the Phoenix Ghost's thunder. The weapon was conceived by the US Air Force Special Operations Command as a way of rapidly giving infantry a way to provide their own air support in Afghanistan. Traditional air support may not always be available or take time to respond. Plus, it can cause serious collateral damage. The Switchblade 300, however, can be carried by individual soldiers and used for both reconnaissance and attack, dropping down from above directly on an enemy's head. When the weapon was first sent to Afghanistan, it was on a test case basis and in limited numbers. In 2012, US soldiers received 75 Switchblades to try them out in real-world conditions. The result of that test remains classified, but very shortly afterwards, the US Army made a request that the weapon be immediately made available in far greater numbers. Insurgents soon feared it and US soldiers loved it. Soon after its debut in Afghanistan, the Switchblade was tested from the open bay of an Osprey transport, successfully tracking and impacting its target. This paved the way for a new development between Switchblade manufacturer AeroVironment and Kratos Defense and Security Solutions for a high-speed, long-range, unmanned combat air vehicle that could act as a mothership to a host of Switchblade drones. The UCV would be designed to rapidly deploy an overwhelming number of Switchblades in order to overcome enemy defenses. The US has provided over 1,000 of both the anti-personnel and anti-armor version of the Switchblade drone, which Ukraine has used to devastating effectiveness. In response to the overwhelming success of the Switchblade, Russia has announced development of its own loitering munition, the LAOP-500, which it boasts twice as powerful as the Switchblade. Given the fact that Russia is bringing T-62s out of museums to fight in Ukraine, take that boast with a grain of salt. So why can't Russia stop these American drones? The easiest answer is that Russia simply wasn't prepared for modern warfare. Despite its many pre-invasion boasts of being able to take on even the military forces of the US, Russia has proven it simply has no idea how to fight a modern war. It has failed to conduct large-scale combined arms operations and displayed time and again a complete disregard for electronic and signal security. The devastation delivered by Western-provided smart munitions proves that it fundamentally was unprepared for the consequences of a smart battlefield. The hard answer, however, is that nobody is really prepared for the loitering munition threat posed by modern drones. There is simply no way of providing adequate protection to infantry forces from loitering munitions, though the US has been working on the problem for a few years now. Electronic warfare capabilities meant to disrupt drone signals or even shoot them down with electromagnetic pulse weapons are now being seen as integral to the very structure of the traditional American infantry platoon. So, the next time big, tough US infantrymen go to war, expect to see Geek Squad fighting right alongside them, because without electronic warfare support, infantry is too vulnerable in future conflicts. Stinger. At the start of the war, Russian air forces operated in large numbers across the country. By now, Russian rotary aviation is conspicuously absent from the front lines. The reason is the US-made FIM-92 Stinger and similar platforms provided by other Western countries. Russian aviation is having traumatic flashbacks to the Afghanistan war, when its helicopters were mauled by US-supplied Stingers. Today, the weapon system has been updated but remains relatively the same as it was when liberating communist aviators from their earthly troubles in 1985. The Stinger is a shoulder-fired man-portable air defense weapon, or a MANPAD, that can engage targets up to 3,800 meters away, making it perfect for taking out low-flying aircraft such as helicopters. Its smart seeker head can differentiate between the exhaust plume of an enemy aircraft and its engines, helping it home in for a successful kill. To fire the weapon, a battery coolant unit, or BCU, is inserted into the gripstock. This delivers a supply of high-pressure argon gas, which cryogenically cools the seeker to operating temperature. This causes the seeker to be very sensitive to heat sources, thus allowing it to lock on to enemy vehicles with great precision. Once fired, a small ejection motor pops the missile clear of the operator and to a safe range, where the main rocket motor is activated, sending the missile on its way. The warhead is relatively small, only about 2.26 pounds of HTA-3 explosive, a mix of HMX, TNT, and aluminum powder. However, the weapon is designed to directly impact the vehicle's engines, which can be easily damaged or destroyed even with a small amount of explosives. So why is the Stinger once more violently reuniting Russian aircraft with the ground? Once more, it comes down to doctrine. Russian forces are doing a poor job of integrating air power with ground forces, leaving low-flying Russian aircraft at great threat from man-portable weapons. However, the real culprit is Russia's basic lack of precision targeting. Most of its ground attack aircraft lack targeting pods, meaning they have to come in low for any attack to have a large degree of precision. This puts them directly under the threat of the Stinger. HIMARS. We couldn't possibly do an episode on US weapons Russia's having a very bad day with and not mention the vaunted HIMARS system. This thing is not very impressive on paper. The high-mobility artillery rocket system is, at first glance, underpowered rocket artillery. Unlike its more capable cousin, the M270 MLRS, the HIMARS system has half the number of munitions available to it, 6 GMLRS rockets. It's basically just a truck with a single pod of missiles on its back, so why in the world has this weapon single-handedly changed the face of the Ukrainian war? In the early 1990s, the US Army was retooling itself from fighting World War III against the Soviet Union and its allies to the expected Bush Wars of the future, which would feature low-intensity conflict. This meant the Army needed to slim down and start providing weapons that were mobile and flexible, something traditional rocket artillery is not. HIMARS was developed to meet the need of a light footprint force such as US paratroopers or a small contingent of overseas troops fighting a conflict requiring precision rather than overwhelming firepower. Mounted on a truck, the system has far greater mobility and speed than any of its tracked cousins, and this was a huge draw for a future low-intensity conflict. However, it was exactly this capability that would make HIMARS so valuable to Ukrainian forces. Faced with overwhelming numbers, Ukraine needed a platform that could rapidly deliver a fire mission and then flee before enemy counter-battery fire or air support could respond. Traditional tube artillery would be based around areas in Ukraine, could enact some form of air defense which protected them, but made them very inflexible weapons. HIMARS, however, could quickly drive to a launch site, pop off its missiles, and drive away in minutes, allowing the weapon system to be anywhere it needed to be with short notice. But it's HIMARS's precision and range that makes it truly deadly. Each of the 6 GLMRS rockets have a range of 57 miles and are armed with precision warheads. This gives Ukraine the ability to punch behind enemy lines at targets out of range of traditional tube artillery, which has a range of around a dozen or so miles. But it's the precision that really matters, because each rocket can be programmed to hit a specific target or to double up and defeat enemy fortifications, striking exactly at their weakest point. The error radius of HIMARS is classified but believed to be no more than a few meters at most, and is likely far, far less than that, given the history of US smart weapons. With just a dozen of these weapons at the start of summer, Ukraine began to batter Russian command posts and logistics nodes, leading to an immediate effect on the battlefield as Russian forces were slowed to a crawl. As they contended with the chaos being wreaked behind their lines, Russia quickly moved to neutralize the weapon, dedicating large amounts of air power and special operations forces to locating and destroying these mobile rocket launchers. Within weeks of the deployment of HIMARS to Ukraine, Russia claimed it had destroyed all of them, yet the US confirmed that not a single HIMARS had been lost in combat. Was Russia lying? Normally the answer to that question would be yes, but in this case they actually might have been telling the truth, at least from their own point of view, because the weapon is mounted on a generic heavy-duty truck frame. Ukraine created multiple HIMARS decoys using trucks painted green. Other decoys were mere mock-ups made of wood, and it's confirmed that Russia has destroyed at least 10 of these decoys with Caliber cruise missiles. Russia took the bait and expended significant effort and resources better used elsewhere to find and destroy these fake HIMARS, leaving the real HIMARS safe from attack. The US quickly agreed to supply Ukraine with more HIMARS, and the nation now has just under 24 of these platforms with plans for more to be delivered. As of September 8th, Ukraine has struck 400 Russian targets with the weapons, making it the hardest working weapon in the Ukraine war, and one that has forced Russia to radically rethink how it deploys its forces. No longer safe behind the front lines, Russian command and control nodes and logistics hubs have been forced out of HIMARS range, which means the rate of the offensive has slowed to a crawl as units have to wait even longer for resupply. Russia has threatened to retaliate against the United States for further deliveries of the weapon system, but given that it can't handle 16 of these and the US Army is equipped with over 400, it seems Russia's mouth is cashing checks its military can't cash. Snipers, bodyguards armed with handguns that can punch through body armor, helicopter gunships, and trained attack bears. We only made one of those up, but the protection of the President of Russia is absolutely insane. The American president has the Secret Service, and his counterpart in Russia has their own elite bodyguard unit, the Presidential Security Service. Part of the Federal Protective Service, this arm of the Russian government is responsible for protecting high-ranking Russian government figures and has a whopping 50,000 employees. The PSS, though, is only responsible for protecting the Russian president and prime minister, and they are very good at their job. Much of the way the PSS operates is similar to the way the American Secret Service operates, but this isn't copycatting, it's simply because the fundamentals of security don't change no matter what country you're in. However, the PSS has at least one additional requirement that the American Secret Service doesn't when dealing with the president as image-conscious as Vladimir Putin. Long before the Russian president steps foot on a plane to a new meeting or a vacation spot, his security team is already hard at work. Every single destination needs to be thoroughly checked for a wide variety of potential threats, and this includes every single road to be traveled and potential stop or visit. The first threat analyzed is the criminal one. A large number of organized crime syndicates would profit greatly from the abduction or even assassination of a government leader. Just imagine what Mexican cartels would do to get their hands on the American president. Thus, the Russian president's security detail meticulously analyzes the criminal threat to the president directly, or to any asset the president might be using during his travels. The last thing Putin's security detail wants is to accidentally travel down a road well known for frequent gun battles between rival criminal gangs, even if they probably seriously outgun any street gang on planet Earth. Next on the agenda is analyzing any potential for social unrest. The president's security detail will work to make sure that any potential travel route or visit avoids locations that are potentially hotspots for citizen unrest. Imagine what might happen if Xi Jinping had traveled through Hong Kong during the massive riots that rocked the city, or if the American president's travel plans had included a road trip through the city of Ferguson during its own social unrest. However, this part of the screening process includes analyzing the potential for social unrest actually inspired by the president himself. Putin has proven to be a particularly divisive figure in Russia, and frequently the target of ire by pro-democracy groups, LGBTQ rights activists, and women's rights activists. Once, Putin was accosted by feminist protesters during a visit to Hanover. While it's doubtful the protesters would have caused any actual harm, his bodyguards were immediately on hand to ensure Putin wasn't harmed or potentially embarrassed. Safeguarding the president from social unrest he may inspire himself includes carefully vetting any visitors or attendees to events Putin goes to, and even blacklisting individuals or groups from participating. Next is analyzing the possibility of natural disasters in the area the president might be visiting. This is done by looking at historical data and gaining access to good long-range weather forecasting. Some natural disasters can be easily predicted, or at least given a good probability of occurring or not. This includes seasonal events such as flooding and typhoons. Others, however, are completely unpredictable, such as earthquakes, or Kylie Jenner dropping her own album. In either case, the president's protection detail needs to have a well-established contingency plan that includes the capability to escape a natural disaster entirely before or after it struck. If escape is impossible, the protection detail must have the necessary tools to shelter in place while the Russian military enacts a plan to extract the president. Lastly is a concern unique to Russia's current and very image-conscious Vladimir Putin. The last thing the president detail can let happen is to let the Russian president be assassinated. The second to last thing is to let him look foolish. For Vladimir Putin, this is especially important, as the current Russian president has worked to carefully cultivate a strong, manly image through various photo shoots, which include him suntanning in the Russian wilderness, riding a horse shirtless, joining an underwater research excursion, swimming in a wild Russian lake, and hunting shirtless for some reason. While these photo shoots have been very successful at growing his popularity with segments of the Russian population, other Russians have fought back by making Vladimir Putin the most memeable world leader. Thus, the Presidential Protective Service has to be ever conscious of how a visit could affect the Russian president's public image. A month out from a potential visit, security experts inspect the location and especially the accommodations where the president will be staying. The location is carefully checked for any potential security vulnerabilities, and any employees are carefully vetted by the security team. Lastly, every single item inside the president's accommodations is inspected and repaired well before his arrival. That way, during the stay, there is no need for any technician or repairman to visit. With just a few weeks before the president's stay, technical experts install radio and cell signal jammers. These devices will help prevent any potential IEDs or planted explosives from being detonated via radio or cell phone. However, it also helps to ensure the president isn't potentially spied on by hidden electronics that a sweep might have missed. Unique to the Russian president's security detail is the ability to ping any and all smart devices in proximity to where the president is expected to stay or travel. Russian laws allow the president's security team to use tapping hardware and software on any electronic device they believe will be in proximity to the president. They're also given the authority to execute body searches without the same legal restrictions a police officer might have, gain access to absolutely any building or organization, and seize any vehicle they may deem necessary for the protection of the president or that might pose a threat. So, who gets to protect one of the most powerful men in the world? First, you must be over 21 but younger than 35 at the time of application. You also have to be able to complete a stringent physical exam, so only those in peak physical shape should even think of applying. Next, you must be between 175 and 190 centimeters, so that you're physically large enough to shield the president with your own body, but not so tall as to experience difficulty in tight physical confines or draw attention to yourself. The requirements to join the Presidential Security Service are surprisingly similar to that of the American Secret Service. Combat experience is not required, and in fact, good candidates are more defensively minded than offensive. That's because, as explained by a former Presidential Security Service employee, a soldier is meant to attack, but a bodyguard is meant to defend and protect. Being a presidential bodyguard can be much more challenging than being a soldier, as most of the threats that a Presidential Security Service member will face are going to be clandestine. A good candidate must have an excellent attention to detail and only the best of situational awareness. Any member in a crowd can be a potential attacker, and even the sweet old lady waiting in line to shake the president's hand could be carrying a hidden gun in her purse. A good bodyguard must keep an eye on a wide variety of potential threat vectors, and yet remain aware enough to react to a completely unexpected threat. Even more important, though, is the psychological component. A president's bodyguard's job is not to apprehend or eliminate an attacker, but to protect the president, even at the cost of their own life. Thus, while a normal police officer or soldier might have the instinct to neutralize an attacker first, a Russian president's bodyguard will instead put themselves between the president and the threat, even before drawing their pistol. This is why defensive thinking is more important than offensive thinking. The Presidential Security Service must also be well versed in different languages given the Russian president's frequent travel abroad. This is so agents can understand if any threat is present in the area by listening to and understanding the conversations of the locals. Next, they must have a good sense for proper etiquette in politics while remaining tactful at all times. In this video, a security team member tactfully asks UFC fighter Conor McGregor to remove his arm from around Putin's shoulder. A big no-no that could have caused an embarrassing public incident if the bodyguard had overreacted. This is also why only calm and level-headed individuals are allowed to guard the most powerful man in Russia. The last thing President Putin needed here was an over-anxious bodyguard making a scene with a major public figure like McGregor. We have to admit, though, the entire staff of the infographic show would love to have seen a Russian presidential bodyguard go toe-to-toe with a UFC champion, and our money is on the bodyguard. That's because of the incredible training they undergo. Details are very scarce given the secrecy of the Russian government, but it's known that much like their American counterparts, Russian presidential bodyguards are experts in hand-to-hand combat and have incredible stamina and tolerance for extreme heat and cold. Even the coldest conditions, these men must be able to tolerate the weather in only light overcoats, since heavy overcoats would hinder their agility and ability to move quickly. Rumors even have it that the Russian presidential bodyguards take a variety of drugs that directly affect their physiology. This could include the use of amphetamines for alertness or perhaps even human growth hormones or steroids to increase strength and endurance. Again, given the secrecy of the Russian government, these remain only rumors. But would you really be surprised to learn that Vladimir Putin is protected by a team of bodyguards jacked up on experimental super soldier serums? While the president is out and about, the PSS operates almost exactly as the American Secret Service. First, the president is closely protected by a team of elite bodyguards who are ever present and within feet of him at all times. These men are trained to put themselves directly in the path of an attacker and take a bullet for the Russian president if necessary. As such, they carry body armor under their suits or jackets, and even carry special bulletproof briefcases which can be used as shields. They also carry well-concealed handguns capable of punching through body armor at a range of up to 50 meters, and submachine guns. Sometimes they even carry Kevlar umbrellas, which can protect from bullets and shrapnel. Next is the president's second circle of protection, arguably the most important. These individuals are usually invisible and don't look like government agents at all. That's because they're trained to blend into crowds so as to ascertain threats from within. They'll dress like regular civilians and work the crowd, identifying troublemakers and radioing their teammates about potential threats or individuals to be concerned about. They're also meant to act before an attacker has even had a chance to threaten the president. An individual suddenly shoving others out of the way might just be an overeager fan or a deranged gunman, and it's the second circle's job to neutralize them before they get a chance to threaten the president. The third circle of protection works along the perimeter of the crowd and carefully checks for threats from the outside. These agents will be dressed like their comrades, both to identify them as security detail members, but also to make themselves a threat and discourage an attack. If the president's security detail is highly visible and in large numbers, it can act as a visual deterrent, discouraging a would-be attacker by making them believe they'd just fail anyway. The fourth circle of protection is made up of elite spotters and snipers situated in tactically advantageous points around the president's location. Their job is not just to keep an eye on the crowd and act accordingly, but even more importantly to act as counter-snipers, as the greatest threat to the president is going to come from a sniper. The president's own snipers have to be able to identify the most likely threat vectors for a sniper attack and keep tabs on them, and act to accurately and immediately neutralize any threat. Lastly, the Russian president is typically escorted by a special unit of heavily armed security personnel. These heavies are responsible for extracting the president from any potential situation or for neutralizing a heavily militarized threat to the president. They're capable of protecting not just from a human threat, but of employing anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons to protect against heavy vehicles and airborne threats. For almost 2 decades, Russia had been steadily climbing out of their economic hole that it found itself in at the end of the Cold War. Overnight, it found itself right back in the bottom of that hole. But just how bad Russia's future will get just may be shocking to some viewers. Russia's invasion of Ukraine might have begun in February 2022, but Russia was preparing for this since the first international sanctions against it in 2014 over its annexation of Crimea. For years, Russia carefully built up a massive war chest of over $600 billion, all with the goal of softening the blow to its economy from any potential sanctions over further military aggression. Quite literally overnight, Russia lost access to half of that money thanks to some of the toughest sanctions ever imposed on a country. Putin's plan was a good one. He expected there would be sanctions placed on Russia due to the invasion, so the $600 billion held in foreign reserves could be used to prop up the Russian economy until hostilities ended. However, the West's plan was even better. Simply freeze all of that money and deny Russia access to it. To be fair, Putin never imagined that the West would unify so rapidly, and he certainly never dreamt that Western nations would be willing to hurt themselves to sanction Russia. When Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, international sanctions were light, with the US putting most of the pressure on Russia. There was little reason to believe a wider invasion would result in such drastic response. Without access to its war chest, Russia was forced to take extreme actions to try to protect its economy. First, it shut down its stock market. At first, it was only for a few days, but soon it was announced the market would remain closed for weeks. It was only in late March that the Russian stock market opened up again, once fears of investors pulling out all of their assets were largely minimized. Second, Russia's central bank raised interest rates as high as a whopping 20% in order to combat the depression of the ruble, which immediately after the invasion fell in value by as much as 40%. The interest rate hike was meant to slow down lending and big-ticket purchases, but in March, Russia's inflation still hit 16.7%, compared to the US's 8.54%, which is itself extremely abnormally high. Even before the invasion of Ukraine, though, Russia's economic future looked extremely shaky. In 2015 and 2016, Russia experienced an economic crisis fueled by both a drop in the price of oil and international sanctions against Russia. If you're wondering why your own country's economy doesn't collapse when oil prices drop, it's because Russia lacks a well-diversified economy. Oil and gas make up as much as 40% of state revenue, and the Natural Resources and Environment Ministry estimates that natural resources make up as much as 60% of the country's GDP. This is perhaps not surprising given the vast size of Russia, which gives it some of the largest reserves of oil, natural gas, minerals, and other resources in the world, all of which are vital for modern industry. Oil and gas alone make up 40% of Russia's exports. Access to some of the largest natural resource deposits in the world, however, has been perhaps a greater curse than a blessing. While it's made individuals very rich inside Russia, which boasts the fifth largest number of billionaires, the lack of a diversified economy has also led to it coming at the top of wealth inequality charts amongst developed nations. It's also a massive strategic vulnerability for the nation, as it makes its economy incredibly easy to target and cripple by foreign powers. To that end, Russia has done everything it can to influence Western nations to shy away from renewable energy, including directly backing the campaigns of public officials in the West who work to dismantle green energy initiatives. It's also worked hard to create energy dependence from Western nations, and today Germany is but one of the many victims of its own dependence on Russia for energy needs. The fact that Russia provides most of Germany's energy makes the nation extremely reluctant to publicly oppose it, as evidenced by Germany's lack of military support for Ukraine until only recently, and its outright refusal to support a complete ban on Russian energy in order to punish it where it hurts it the most. Russia would take 2 years to emerge from the financial crisis of 2014 through 2016, during which vast sums of money left the Russian economy as investors lost confidence in the ruble. What was an economic crisis, though, is today an economic catastrophe, with consequences that will haunt Russia for years to come. To try to more directly influence the economy, Putin has spent 2 decades turning Russia's fledgling market economy into a Soviet-style command economy. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, they say, even when those tricks are very obviously not working. In 2003, Putin began to take control of Yukos, the country's largest oil company. At its height, Yukos produced 20% of Russia's oil, and this caught the eye of Putin, who began to engineer a scheme to take direct control of the company. First, he orchestrated the creation of fake tax bills, which the Russian government claimed Yukos had not been paying. Yukos was presented with $27 billion in unpaid taxes, a sum so preposterously large that the company couldn't hope to pay it off. This is exactly what Putin wanted, as he then ordered a freeze on all of Yukos' assets and began ordering the company assets be seized by the government in order to pay off the massive tax bill. Those assets were then sold at pennies on the dollar to state-owned companies who quickly put them to use under Putin's careful watch. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was arrested by the police and then charged with fraud. He would be sentenced to prison for 10 years before being pardoned by Putin, after which he immediately fled the country and became one of Putin's biggest critics. However, at home, the lesson was clear. Do as Putin says, or he steals all your wealth and throws you in prison. Few Russian oligarchs needed to be taught this lesson directly after Khodorkovsky's example. Rosneft and Gazprom became Russia's largest players in the energy market, and as state-owned enterprises, Putin was largely free to do as he wished with the money that the companies made. He enriched himself with the profits to an unknown degree. To this day, Putin's true wealth, all of it stolen, is unknown, but many suspect his robbery of the Russian people has made him the richest man in the world. Putin, however, also put the state-owned companies to use by funding kickbacks for his allies amongst the Russian security services. With close friends paid off to the tune of millions, Russia's infamous security services now serviced Putin directly. He put their loyalty to great effect by using Russia's security apparatus to spy on and intimidate political opponents or critics, and even outright kill them. Anyone who might speak up against Putin's bold use of Soviet-style intimidation and assassination was probably already on his payroll or about to be intimidated and assassinated themselves. Putin was now in direct control of the most important sector of the Russian economy, and those entrepreneurs who played nice with him were allowed to launch their own successful enterprises, such as Novatek and Sibur. However, anyone who did not play by Putin's playbook found business extremely difficult to conduct inside bureaucratic Russia. In fact, such heavy bureaucracy and rampant corruption made Russia an extremely unappealing market for foreign investors, only further hurting the Russian economy. But after the financial crisis of 2014 to 2016, Putin worked to secure his hold over the Russian economy even further. Now truly independent businesses with a certain level of success were being put under pressure to sell to the state. Magnet, for example, one of Russia's largest grocery retail chains, found itself under intense pressure to sell to the government, and its founder, Sergei Galitsky, proved no fool when he sold most of his shares in his own business to a state lender. While he got a $2.5 billion payday, he also lost ownership of the business he had started himself and grew to be one of the world's largest grocery retailers. Galitsky was smart and played ball, but others were not so smart. Enriched by their collusion with the Kremlin, many of these wealthy individuals now resisted selling their businesses to the government. Most of these oligarchs would end up in exile or simply imprisoned under false charges. Despite the Kremlin controlling the bulk of the Russian economy with a very heavy hand, there was still room for small to medium-sized businesses to find success while avoiding enough of it to draw Putin's eye of Sauron-like gaze. With relations between Russia and the West relatively cordial, many Western businesses moved into Russia in order to service its growing middle class. Nestle, IKEA, H&M, and Adidas all moved in, amongst hundreds of others, helping to bolster the Russian economy. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to an unprecedented exodus out of Russia by foreign businesses, with the pullout of revenue worth an estimated $200 billion to the Russian economy. Major brands to pull out include Nestle, which suspended sales of the vast majority of goods it imported regularly to Russia. British American Tobacco left its Russian business altogether, and Philip Morris reduced Russian manufacturing and suspended future investments for the country. TJX, owner of TJ Maxx and Marshalls, is divesting its equity ownership in Familia, an off-price retail popular in the country, while H&M and Nike both have completely suspended sales in Russia. Perhaps the most devastating of all for the Russian people, however, is the suspension of all sales of Adidas products, to include tracksuits. Just as devastating, though, was the pullout of major foreign players in the Russian financial sector. Société Générale, France's third-largest bank, sold its controlling stake in Rosbank, which resulted in a loss of $3.3 billion in capital for Russian lenders. Deutsche Bank is in the process of winding down business in Russia and helping its clients cease their own operations inside the country. Goldman Sachs bid Russia's Svidanya, followed hours later by JP Morgan Chase. American Express, MasterCard, and Visa all delivered a crippling blow to Russian travelers by announcing that their cards would no longer work outside of Russia if issued inside Russia. Those cards issued outside Russia would likewise not work inside the country. The mass exodus of foreign businesses in Russia has led to the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs and skyrocketed unemployment to over 9% after having reached a record low in March. The unemployment rate is not expected to drop below 5% for years as the true cost of sanctions hit the Russian labor market, and the exodus of foreign businesses has seen retail sales drop by 10%. In response, the Russian government has allocated 39 billion rubles, or $466 million, toward emergency benefits, temporary employment, and public works projects in the hopes of stemming the economic harm of massive unemployment. In the short term, this is an effective strategy employed by the likes of the United States, which invested billions into jobs programs and benefits during the financial crisis of 2008. But even $466 million is a paltry figure for a nation of 144 million. And with foreign investment and business not returning to the country anytime soon, that money will run out in mere months. To try to limit the impact of foreign businesses pulling out of Russia, the Kremlin has nationalized many of the businesses once operated by foreign companies. McDonald's stores are set to be taken over by a new state-owned family-friendly restaurant, Uncle Vanya's, complete with a very familiar-looking logo. The goal is to stop the bleeding caused by the sudden pullout of Western businesses by preserving the jobs and income through simply replacing the foreign operators and creditors. Any concerns over intellectual property rights are completely disregarded, as Russia has decided not to honor the copyrights or IP rights of any business which is deemed hostile to Russia or its people. This might seem like a good idea, simply replace foreign businesses with a Russian equivalent. But thanks to the freezing of Russia's foreign currency reserves, the Kremlin's ability to support vast amounts of businesses once financed by foreign corporations is limited at best. Then there's that simple matter of expertise and brand identity. People go to a McDonald's or a KFC all over the world because of their preference for that specific food. Simply replacing who runs an abandoned restaurant isn't going to lead to the same popular demand for what's now essentially a completely different product. But the greatest concern might be a foreign business or investor's reluctance to one day re-enter Russia, given how quickly the Kremlin was to completely trample all over their copyright and intellectual property protection laws. If there's a fear of the government simply stealing your idea or product and giving it to a domestic lackey, foreign corporations and investors have little incentive to bring large sums of money into the country. This means that in the future, Russia will find it incredibly difficult to lure in big investors and companies and build a truly modern, forward-looking economy. Instead, it's dooming itself to a future where the West continues to lead the world in innovation and Russia remains merely a consumer of Western products and ideas. Russia is essentially in crisis mode and attempting to build a self-sustaining economy. While projected to experience a GDP loss of 11% over the next year, this will likely gradually stabilize. However, stabilization does not mean growth, and the Russian economy is expected to grow only by tiny increments over the next few years. This is a catastrophic turn of events for the Russian people, who can expect to see a rapid decline in Russia's middle class and a return to Soviet-era economic woes, just as Putin does his best to steer the Russian economy back to a Soviet-style self-sufficiency model. While this might keep the Russian economy from completely imploding, it means an end to the prosperity the average Russian was beginning to enjoy as the nation pulled itself out of the rubble of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Perhaps the greatest blow to the Russian economy, however, is the brain drain experienced by the mass exodus of Russia's artists, intellectuals, and skilled workers. Chafing under an increasingly authoritarian regime, Russia's elites are leaving the country in droves, crippling its ability to build a competitive economy. There's already a major fear of a shortage of qualified STEM specialists. The future of the Russian economy is a thoroughly grim one, unless Putin immediately reverses course and the world decides to forgive Russia overnight for their invasion of Ukraine. As this is extremely unlikely, Russia is set to become a second world nation within Europe as it remains economically isolated from the world. Things will only get worse as the West targets Russia's energy sector, its most important sector and the entire linchpin of the Russian economy. A complete ban on Russian energy by the West would see the economy contract by over 20%, and plans are already in place to gradually phase out Russian coal, oil, and natural gas across the European Union over the next few years. This will cripple Russia's most important economic sector, completely nullifying any possible political gains made by successfully invading Ukraine, something Russia also seems not capable of achieving. While Asian nations will inevitably pick up the slack of Western energy imports from Russia, such as India, which is hungrily buying up cheap Russian oil, it will not be enough in the long run to save Russia's economy from shrinking dramatically. On February 24, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin sought to make his mark on Russian history by restoring Ukraine to a puppet state and pushing NATO back and away from its borders. Instead, President Putin will go down in history as the man who made NATO great again and even added additional countries to its roster. But why is Russia so scared of Finland and Sweden joining NATO? The Russian invasion of Ukraine was provoked in large part by the nation's refusal to submit to the Kremlin authority. After a presidential coup in 2014, Ukraine looked like it was on a path to join the West and leave Russia behind. Enshrined in its constitution was an amendment that Ukraine would pursue NATO membership as a matter of highest priority, and work began on meeting the requirements for entry into the alliance. For Russia's President Vladimir Putin, this was beyond unacceptable. Historically, Russia has suffered greatly from European invaders, ranging from the French during the Napoleonic Wars to the Germans in both world wars. After the Second World War, though, Eastern Europe was severely weakened, and an opportunity opened up for the Soviet Union to expand its sphere of influence all the way to Germany itself. This wasn't just a power grab, though. It was a matter of vital national security for the Russians. By creating a slew of client states across Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union had in essence created a buffer between itself and Western Europe. Now any invasion could be met outside of native territory, saving the lives of millions of Russian citizens and preserving the economy of the nation. A buffer between itself and a potential invader is especially important because Russia's strategic position in Europe is extremely weak. The nation sits at the eastern end of the Great European Plain, a vast stretch of flat territory that is impossible to defend. Historically, Russian forces have struggled to hold off invaders coming from its west, as the landscape offers few natural defensive features. And with the advent of modern high-speed warfare, the strategic picture only grew grimmer for the Russians. During World War be thrown askew, and now favored the NATO alliance in case of a war. The addition of Ukraine would have been an unmitigated disaster, as now Russia would be flanked by NATO both to the northwest and the south, with Moscow just a few hundred miles in either direction for hostile forces. Even more importantly, Ukraine's ascension to NATO would have given the alliance complete and unmitigated control over the Black Sea, shutting Russian Black Sea ports off from the world and giving the alliance incredible control over the sea routes that Russia relies on for both imports and exports. The military invasion of Ukraine has, for now at least, put a stop to Ukraine's joining of either the EU or NATO, but in response, Sweden and Finland, two nations that have remained staunchly neutral, are now in very serious discussions about joining the alliance. In fact, by the time you watch this video, they may have already expressed publicly their desire to do so. Finland has a troubled history with Russia. During World War II, the Soviet Union invading Finland under the auspices of increasing security for the important seaport of St. Petersburg. At first, Stalin gave the Finns an ultimatum: grant us several dozen miles of border territory so we can ensure the security of St. Petersburg, then named Leningrad. In exchange, the Soviets would grant Finland several miles of completely useless territory along the northern border. Finland naturally refused, and Stalin used this as an excuse for war. Historians debate whether Stalin ever meant to fully capture Finland or not, though the evidence is strong that he did, given that he enacted a puppet Finnish communist government in occupied territories. Plus, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany meant the Soviets didn't need to fear German intervention nor a possible German threat from the south, freeing them up for a full invasion of Finland. The capture of Finland would have granted them access to Finland's natural resources and allowed them to establish greater control over the Baltic Sea. However, Stalin's ambition would never come to pass, as Finland proved to be a lot tougher than the Soviets had thought. Finnish resistance fought a staunch defensive war in terrain that heavily favored it. However, it was largely the Soviet Union's own military that led to a ceasefire 3 months later, with meager territorial gains. Stalin had, in his paranoia, carried out large purges of the Red Army, eliminating many senior leaders whom he viewed as a threat to his rule. While this might have secured his political office, it left the Soviet army without experienced professional officers, replaced instead with politically indoctrinated and loyal stooges who cared more about ensuring political loyalty than actually discipline and training. The price to the Soviet Union was great in manpower and resources, though it did win approximately 9% of Finland's territory, more than originally asked for. However, its international standing was severely hurt, which in turn affected just how much aid it would later receive in its war against Germany. Perhaps more tragic of all for the Soviets, though, is the fact that the war proved to Hitler that the Soviet Union was a weak, ineffective power. a clumsy giant with a large military but not good at wielding it. This convinced Hitler that invading the Soviet Union was possible after all, even while at war with the Western Allies, and would cost the Soviets millions of lives. Given its history with the Soviets, Finland remained neutral throughout the Cold War and sought instead to appease Moscow by establishing bilateral relations. While it cooperated with NATO forces and international missions, it did not wish to join the alliance for fear of provoking its next-door neighbor. Sweden likewise had maintained a policy of cooperation but neutrality with the West, believing it to be safer to remain neutral than potentially provoke a Russian retaliation. For 75 years, public opinion polls in both nations showed that the majority of citizens wished to remain neutral, and it isn't hard to see why. In case of war, their countries were right next door to Russia, while most of NATO was still far from the Russian border. The heaviest fighting of any war would be taking place on their soil. However, after February 24th, the security situation in Europe has been completely rewritten, and public opinion polls mirror that, with, for the first time in their history, a majority of Finnish and Swedish citizens wishing to join NATO. The invasion of Ukraine has proven to the two longtime neutral countries that if Russia doesn't like what's going on inside your borders, it's very likely to invite itself in and change matters how it sees fit. Now Finland and Sweden have a reason to fear that their neutrality is no longer a security guarantee, and any prior agreement with Russia is essentially worthless. After all, Ukraine had an agreement with Russia to preserve its independence in exchange for Cold War-era Soviet nuclear weapons left behind on its territory after the fall of the Union. For Russia, Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO would mean that it's essentially blocked from the Baltic Sea in case of hostilities. Now, NATO members would threaten Russian ships on all sides and allow NATO navies to operate right off of Russia's own shores by providing nearby replenishment and resupply. American aircraft carriers could, for instance, operate safely inside the Baltic Sea for the first time in history after a thorough sweep of the Russian Baltic Fleet by NATO ships. Having two or more American supercarriers parked right off its own shore is a nightmare scenario for Russia, as it would be for any country, and the accession of the two Nordic countries to NATO would make this possible. Finland and Sweden joining NATO also turns the entire Nordic peninsula into a NATO enclave, effectively hemming in the Russians on two sides. NATO air defense installations in Finland could seriously threaten deep parts of Russian territory, limiting the use of Russia's air forces in case of a war. It also places dozens of strategically important targets within striking range of NATO aircraft at the immediate onset of war, forcing Russia to more widely disperse its defensive forces and weakening them, while hampering its ability to launch offensive operations. Even more important, though, as Vladimir Putin sought to improve Russia's security situation against NATO, Finland's membership would mean that instead, Putin created an additional 800 miles of vulnerability thanks to Finland's shared border with Russia. This now places NATO forces less than 60 miles from St. Petersburg and with easy striking distance of additional Russian targets to the north. While Russia might have difficulty moving a few dozen miles into enemy territory to seize a major city, NATO's swift and agile military would have no similar difficulties, and Putin knows this, which is why he's so terrified of NATO gaining a significant presence so close to vulnerable Russian territory. It's unlikely Sweden and Finland will be deterred from joining NATO thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. NATO itself has vowed to fast-track the two countries' memberships, largely thanks to the fact that both Sweden and Finland already fulfill most of the requirements for membership. NATO's 5 requirements for membership include: new members must uphold democratic values and enshrine protections for minority populations, embracing and tolerating diversity. New members must be making progress toward a market economy. This is a Cold War-era leftover, as potential new Eastern European members struggled to throw off the Soviet economic system forced on them. Military forces of new members must be under the firm control of civilian authorities. Military dictatorships need not apply. New members must respect the sovereignty of other nations and be good neighbors. Potential members must be working toward compatibility with NATO forces. This means that their military command structure, training, and equipment must meet strict standards to ensure that a new member is not a liability in time of war. Equipment used by a new member must also show some degree of interoperability with other NATO members to ease the burden of logistics. If 29 of the NATO members are using a specific caliber rifle, but a 30th is using a different caliber, it makes logistics for the 30th member much more difficult. NATO members must be able to share and use equipment in time of war. Sweden and Finland are both vibrant democracies with strong liberal values. Unlike authoritarian Russia, their militaries are both very well equipped and extremely proficient, easily meeting NATO training and operational standards. Membership into the alliance can be fast-tracked for both countries, seeing as they so easily fit the NATO mold already. However, there is a fear that Vladimir Putin will retaliate before both countries can formally join NATO and enjoy Article 5 protection of the alliance. He's already stated that there would be severe military and economic consequences if either nation sought out NATO membership. For this reason, NATO has already approved temporary commitment to protect both nations during the application process, which could still take months. This way, Russia cannot bully or intimidate Sweden or Finland as they contemplate this momentous decision, and the two nations are free to choose for themselves what path to take to national security. Given Russia's performance in Ukraine, it's highly unlikely that it will risk war against Finland and Sweden's completely modern militaries in order to prevent them from joining NATO. Right now, Russia can only afford to lose one war at a time, and even without NATO, both Finland and Sweden working together could make a Russian attack against them an extremely costly one that would see little political or territorial gain. Given that the terrain itself is far more suitable for defensive operations, it seems unlikely that Russia will seek to stop both countries' accession via military means. But it does not eliminate the threat of nuclear attack, a recourse many fear Putin is more than capable of turning to in the face of his military's ineptitude. Without NATO membership, Sweden and Finland are not covered under the American nuclear umbrella the way other nations are, and remain vulnerable to this final and most dramatic of intimidation tactics. A recruit forced to live with a fractured neck. Another had his legs and genitals amputated. What do they have in common? They were violently hazed in the Russian military. The Russian armed forces have tried to move away from a conscription service ever since the early 2000s, when it became clear that if they were to compete against professional Western militaries, they would need their own fully volunteer military force. Historically, conscripts have vastly underperformed versus professional soldiers due to worse morale and esprit de corps. But conscription also severely weakens a military in one key area: expertise. When a military over-relies on conscripts, it's reduced to a constantly rotating body of soldiers, which leaves that military without any professional veterans. This lack of veterancy severely negatively impacts the performance of any military and leads to a weak non-commissioned or junior officer corps, a problem Russia is intimately familiar with and largely explains its terrible performance in Ukraine. Russia has been unable to transition to an all-volunteer military despite efforts to boost pay and benefits. However, it has managed to reduce its dependency on conscripts greatly. Today, about a third of the Russian military is made up of conscripts, and these conscripts are typically assigned to rear area jobs such as logistics, maintenance, and artillery corps. Russia's frontline forces, at least in theory, are fully professional, and under Russian law, conscripts cannot be used for military action outside of Russia's borders. As we've seen in Ukraine, though, Russian law means little, even for Russians, as conscripts make up a significant portion of the forces fighting there. Russia has 2 conscription drives a year. The first is in the fall and lasts from October to December 31st, and the second is in the spring, lasting from April 1st to July 15th. All men aged 18 to 27 are eligible for conscription, though teenagers as young as 16 have been pressed into service. Corruption is prevalent throughout the length and breadth of the Russian military, however, and conscripts can often pay as much as $5,000 US to avoid service, which inevitably means that most conscripts come from working-class homes, single-parent families, or orphanages. Wealthier Russians need not fear compulsory service, despite the fact that the Russian constitution explicitly states every Russian's job should be to defend the motherland. Would-be conscripts even go so far as to swallow magnesium crystals to give themselves painful stomach ulcers and avoid the draft, or add drops of blood to their urine samples hoping it'll make them seem unfit for service. Conscripts serve for 1-year terms, though extensions such as that which many in Ukraine are facing today are not uncommon. Upon enlisting, conscripts go through a 1 to 2 month-long basic training, which varies depending on location and is not standardized the way it is in the US. After basic training, conscripts undergo a further 3 to 6 months of advanced training, depending on their assignment, before being assigned to regular units. Russian conscripts must pass a physical examination similar to that required by many Western militaries. This includes a 3-kilometer run that must be finished in 12.4 minutes, a 10-kilometer march that must be completed in less than 56 minutes, a 100-meter dash in under 14.4 seconds, and 12 pull-ups for any soldier in service less than 6 months. For their service, they're paid up to $14 US a month, though this varies. Once more, corruption is to blame, as Russia uses a system where unit commanders are directly sent the wages for their soldiers, and it's up to them to disseminate pay. Thus, most Russian commanders skim off the top of the incoming pay largely from the conscripts who will be gone in a few months anyway, and who have little to no rights inside the Russian military. The curious practice also explains much of the underperformance of the Russian battalion tactical groups in the current war. Officers routinely report their units are fully staffed and fit for combat, despite having suffered combat losses. This way, senior officers can pocket the pay meant for soldiers who have been killed or wounded and removed from the front. Then when the unit is tapped for combat operations because to senior planners it seems like a full-strength unit, it must go to combat with a percentage of its manpower missing. Training during boot camp is split between physical training, weapons training, and unit training. Unlike American boot camp, there's a far less rigid training structure, and it seems like a lot of training is focused on physical training to get conscripts and recruits into shape. By comparison, U.S. basic training differs depending on the branch's service, but focuses on weapons training and physical training alongside classroom training on topics ranging from the law of armed conflict to first aid. Russian recruits also tend to have less oversight during basic training and enjoy relaxing evenings after official training hours are over, even being allowed to watch TV or listen to music until lights out at 10:30. But the real challenge for conscripts isn't training, it's surviving Dedovshchina, the rule of the grandfathers. Russians believe that the rule of the grandfathers makes for tough soldiers. Their performance in Ukraine begs to differ. Hazing inside the Russian military is not limited to conscripts, but conscripts bear the absolute worst of it. The practice is perpetrated by everyone from senior to junior officers, who ignore it or participate in it directly, and even by soldiers just a few years more senior than their victims. No one is safe from hazing in the Russian military, but hazing isn't just about abuse, it's often about outright theft or exploitation. One recruit, Kirill Bobrov, at the Kamenka military base was dragged into a boiler room after his compatriots found out that his grandmother had sent him $14 US in rubles. The drunk soldiers wanted the money for themselves so they could spend it on cigarettes, alcohol, and sweets, and they began to interrogate him on where he'd hidden the money. Bobrov claimed he'd already spent it, but the soldiers didn't believe him, so they began to beat him. As he took the beating and refused to give up the money, one soldier picked up a wooden chair and smashed it directly on Bobrov's head, striking his neck. This would lead to a spinal fracture, which would be completely untreated by the military doctors he reported it to after complaining of extreme pain. They chalked it up to nerves and sent him back to his unit. Bobrov describes being continuously beaten on by senior soldiers and junior officers. They would often get drunk and drag recruits out of their bunks for random beatings to entertain themselves. Few stools or chairs were unbroken inside the barracks, as they'd all been used to beat the recruits with. On his very first night in the barracks, Bobrov was woken by his sergeant and dragged out of bed only to be punched in the stomach and head several times. When he collapsed on the ground, the sergeant then proceeded to kick him in the stomach. Other soldiers would round up the new recruits and order them to fetch them cigarettes with filters within 30 minutes, which was impossible as the base was remote and nowhere near a shopping center. Plus, conscripts are paid pithy sums each month, which is what made the $14 US gift from his grandmother so valuable to Bobrov. It was several months' wages at once. Other times, the recruits would be ordered to bring soldiers money. If they failed, which was often, they were severely beaten. Bobrov would go on to develop a severe infection in his legs that made marching extremely painful. He attempted to escape from the base 3 times, finally successfully fleeing and heading to St. Petersburg, where he contacted an advocacy group called the Soldiers' Mothers Organization. The group sent him to a hospital to get his injuries documented so he could be reported as unfit for service. It's there they found that Bobrov suffered from multiple traumas and concussions, as well as the spinal fracture in his neck. Another soldier, Private Andrei Sichov, described being tied to a chair by his drunk superiors and beaten repeatedly over the course of a night. The only breaks he got was as his seniors returned to their drinking binge, before inevitably coming back to continue the beating. He wisely did not report the situation, but when he reported to the military doctor for treatment of his injuries, the doctor said he was fine. A few days later, gangrene had spread to most of his wounds, and he ended up having both his legs and genitalia amputated. New recruits are often given extremely poor quality uniforms, which helps identify them as duhi, or ghosts. Soldiers who have served for at least 2 years are referred to as old-timers, while anyone past that is known as dede, or grandfather. Without a professional NCO corps, and with most Russian officers too busy working second jobs to pay the cost of their own uniforms and supplies, it's the dedes who are in charge of the barracks, and it's them who are the worst offenders and perpetrators of this systemic abuse. Recruits aren't just abused and have their personal belongings and even wages stolen from them, though. They're also exploited by their superiors. Recruits are often forced to work for locals doing manual labor, for which the locals will pay their senior soldiers, who give nothing to the duhi. This is far from the worst fate, as new recruits are often prostituted out, an appalling practice that's been described as endemic inside the Russian military and is ironic for a culture that is so violently anti-gay. New recruits can face some pretty horrifying and disgusting non-physical abuse, though, as well. They can be sleep-deprived for days or weeks at a time, forced to wake up in the middle of the night and go for runs or do push-ups for hours on end. Sometimes they might be forced to run with little clothing in blistering winter conditions, which leads to frostbite, at times severe enough to require amputations. Recruits are often starved, with their food taken by senior soldiers much like school lunch bullies. However, one of the foulest abuses is the practice of forcing recruits to scrub toilets with a toothbrush. But if you're picturing the pristine porcelain thrones of American basic training, think again. These toilets are often simple holes in the ground, which must be scrubbed clean. If the abuser is particularly sadistic, they'll then force the recruit to brush his teeth with the same toothbrush afterwards. Over time, though, the West has become aware of the most common hazing practices. The first is known as the elephant. This ritual gets its name from the older generation Russian gas mask, which has a trunk-like tube through which a soldier breathes. A recruit would be forced to put on the mask and then have the other end sealed off, cutting off the air supply. The recruit is then forced to recite army regulations, sing patriotic songs, or do PT until they physically pass out. When the mask is unsealed and the recruit takes their first breath, they're immediately punched in the solar plexus. The next practice is known as the Batman. This involves a recruit lying on the bottom bunk of a bunk bed-style army cot. Then they hang on to the top bunk with both their arms and legs and must hold for as long as possible. Several recruits will do the Batman at once, and the last one to let go is spared physical abuse. The first to let go is given the most abuse. The ritual known as the Crazy Deer involves a recruit being ordered to cross their hands over their forehead and bang their head against a wall repeatedly. Inevitably, this leads to concussions, which can be severe. The hazing ritual that led to the amputation of Andrei Sychov's legs and genitalia is known as the television. Here, the recruit sits on a stool while holding another stool with a cup of water balanced on it. The stool he's sitting on is then pulled out from under him, and if the recruit wobbles and lets the cup of water fall, he's severely beaten. The ritual is named the television due to the fact that the recruit intently stares at the cup of water balanced on the stool he's holding while waiting for the stool underneath him to be pulled away. The bicycle involves waiting for a recruit to fall asleep, after which he has pieces of paper rolled together and put between his toes. Then the papers are set on fire. The way the recruit reacts by kicking his legs violently once his feet begin to burn is how the ritual gets its name. The confiscation is simple. Anything that a duha is sent by his family or friends belongs to the older soldiers, who steal everything. The recruit could tell his family and friends to simply send him nothing, except the older soldiers often force them to ask for specific things, and then steal it once it arrives. Next is the dried crocodile, a variation on the Batman. This one involves the recruit suspending himself face down between two bunk beds. Then an AK with a bayonet fixed to it is placed pointing up directly under the recruit. The recruit must cling on for dear life or fall onto the bayonet. Often other soldiers will beat the recruit with pillows trying to get him to fall. The ritual gets its name for the way the suspended recruit looks like a crocodile skin that's been stretched out to dry in the sun. Russian equipment is still largely outdated, which makes the birdie possible. In this ritual, the wires of an old 1930s field telephone is wrapped around two big toes of a recruit. The telephones work by hand cranking, which generates an electrical charge and inevitably shocks the recruit. The harder the phone is cranked, the worse the charge. Billiards is a particularly brutal form of torture. Here, a recruit is ordered to put a billiards ball in his mouth while a soldier whacks it with a pool cue. This inevitably results in missing or chipped teeth. However, another variant of the torture involves forcing the recruit to bend over and drop their pants, and we'll leave the rest to your imagination. The pheasant, however, marks the final torture ritual one must undergo before graduating out of being a duha. In this ritual, the recruit drops his pants and crouches on the legs of an upside-down bench. The older soldiers will then line up and whip his bare butt with metal belt buckles. A recruit must endure 100 lashes to graduate, and if they fall off the bench, they must undergo the entire ritual all over again. Inevitably, all this torture comes with severe consequences. Recruits face lifelong injuries and even extreme amputations, as we saw earlier, with mental disorders not being out of the norm. Suicide is endemic to the Russian armed forces, however, most of it resulting from the practice of dedovshchina. But sometimes the recruits turn their weapons on their tormentors. There have been multiple incidents of recruits killing their fellow soldiers before attempting to flee to the countryside. Soviet Union veterans admit that severe hazing was always a practice in the Red Army, but it has increased exponentially in cruelty ever since the fall of the Soviet Union due to the underfunded state of the Russian military. Russia is not just too economically poor to field the large military that it has, but it's also plagued by rampant corruption, which means funds don't always make it to their designated units. With senior officers too worried about making a living by working a second job, discipline has absolutely crumbled inside the Russian military. The result is not just that life is a living hell for Russian conscripts and even professional soldiers, but that the Russian military is an incompetent mess that is incapable of subduing its far less capable neighbor, Ukraine. Russia's bluff has been called, and now its military might must clash with NATO forces in Eastern Europe. As both sides prepare for battle, there are high stakes in the skies over Eastern Europe as a squadron of F-22s and Su-57s rush to meet each other in a battle the world has been dreading for decades. But who would win between these two state-of-the-art aircraft? The F-22 was developed by Lockheed Martin to be the air dominance fighter of the future and first took flight as a prototype on September 7, 1997. Its origins, however, lie in the Cold War, with the US looking ahead to a future conflict with the Soviet Union. That's why when the plane was officially procured in 1999, it faced a very uncertain future. It was the world's most cutting-edge fighter, and an extremely expensive one at that. The age of great power conflict was thought to be over with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the F-22 was a plane without a mission. Inevitably, Congress approved the termination of future production of F-22s, and the specialized tools and equipment used to create the most advanced fighter in the world were put into storage in case of emergency. The Su-57 Felon is a twin-engine stealth multi-role fighter aircraft developed by Sukhoi for the Russian military. Its origins are much more recent, with development beginning in 1999 as Russia began its process of trying to impose itself as a global power once more. Over the years, though, the Su-57 ran into serious budgeting problems. Initially, Russia, like the US, planned to buy hundreds of the aircraft, but eventually only 16 were actually built. The death blow to the Su-57 program was the ever-worsening Russian economy, as well as the pullout of India's partnership in the program when it was determined that the Su-57's capabilities were not as advertised or worth the investment. Both aircraft depend on stealth for survivability and lethality, but which is better? The Su-57 features specialized design to reduce its radar cross-section, or RCS. This is achieved via techniques such as carefully aligning the edges of the wing and control surfaces so as to minimize the number of directions that radar waves can bounce back. Weapons are carried internally, and its engines are coated with radar-absorbent materials, or RAM. Its canopy features a 70 to 90 nanometer thick metal oxide layer to both absorb radar waves and protect the pilot from UV and thermal radiation. From the front, the Su-57 is more stealthy than a fourth-generation fighter. However, from the side, the aircraft is significantly less stealthy and very vulnerable to detection and targeting. This represents a lack of expertise in stealth by Russian engineers, but is also a design choice, as the Su-57 is meant to operate within the protection of Russian air defenses. Outmatched technologically by the US, Russia has long operated its military under a fortress doctrine that makes maximum use of large numbers of long-range air defenses and ground artillery to fend off advanced US threats. Simply put, a squadron of Su-57s would not be operating far from friendly forces, unlike US F-22s, which are expected to be the very tip of the spear, driving deep into enemy territory. The F-22 was designed with stealth as a top priority, and so much attention was paid to the plane's stealth characteristics that even the design of the pilot's helmet was taken into consideration. Like the Su-57, stealth is built straight into the design of the plane with a delta wing configuration, curved vanes that prevent line of sight to the engine faces and turbines, and special alignment of control surfaces. The plane features a signature assessment system that warns a maintenance crew when the plane's radar signature is degraded and requires repair. And while it is coated in RAM, it's less reliant on it than the B-2. The B-2 is so delicate that it requires a special air-conditioned hangar, like the true prom queen of the US Air Force that she is. But the F-22 was designed to be rugged and tough, and can undergo repairs directly on a flight line. But hiding from the radar is only part of its stealthy design. Its flat thrust vectoring nozzles don't just look super cool from behind, but are specifically engineered to reduce the thermal signature of the big engines and thus reduce the range at which the plane is targetable by heat-seeking missiles. The plane is also designed around tight control of electronic emissions to prevent targeting or detection via electronic noise generated by its powerful radar and radio. It's also specially designed to be quieter than other aircraft and to be difficult to detect with the naked eye at a distance. The result is an aircraft with an RCS which is classified. But Lockheed Martin has confirmed that from some angles the aircraft has an RCS of a steel marble, 0.0001 squared meters. The Su-57, on the other hand, is believed to have an RCS of 0.121 square meter. There's no question that when it comes to stealth, the F-22 is the top dog, but at a price. In order to maintain its stealth features at an optimal level, the plane has a mission-capable rate of 62 to 70%, meaning that if the Su-57 were ever fielded in large numbers, their relative lack of sophisticated stealth technology would make them available for operations more often. Though if Ukraine is anything to go by, maintenance is a very weak point of the Russian military, and both aircraft might struggle to stay in the air throughout a lengthy conflict. In a dogfight, power and maneuverability are what matters, and here the two aircraft show some striking differences. The F-22 features thrust vectoring engines that can pivot up and down, giving it the most maneuverability of any U.S. aircraft. However, the F-22 falls very short of the Su-57, which is one of the most maneuverable planes ever made. Its twin engines feature independent thrust vectoring in all directions, meaning each engine nozzle can point in any direction independent of the other nozzle. That's why the Su-57 impressed spectators at air shows all over the world. And in a dogfight scenario, the F-22 pilot would be reaching for the ejection handle far more frequently than the Russian counterpart. When it comes to power, both planes are also unmatched. The F-22 is equipped with two Pratt & Whitney F-119 afterburning turbofan engines, with each delivering 35,000 pounds of thrust. This gives the F-22 a total of 70,000 pounds of thrust and the ability to supercruise at a classified speed of at least Mach 1.82. Supercruise is an important capability for modern fighters, and one that very few can attain. It's defined as the ability for an aircraft to cruise at speeds of 1.5 times or greater the speed of sound, without the use of afterburners for extended periods of time. Using afterburners burns through an aircraft's fuel tank very quickly, and thus most planes cannot maintain supersonic flight for very long. With great speed, though, comes great fuel consumption, and the F-22 is limited by its size and fuel use to a range of 1,864 miles with external fuel tanks. Its combat radius is believed to be just over 500 miles, with a surface ceiling of 6,500 feet. The Su-57 is equipped with two NPO Lyulka Saturn Izdalai 117 turbofan engines, a significant technological step forward for the Russians. Each engine can produce just shy of 20,000 pounds of dry thrust, giving the aircraft the ability to supercruise at just over Mach 1.6. However, the Su-57's larger body allows it to store more fuel, increasing its range to 2,200 miles with a combat radius of 930 miles and a ceiling of 66,000 feet. The Su-57 seems to have the advantage here, even though its inferior aerodynamics and larger size means it's slower than the nimbler F-22. But the Russian Air Force has been having serious problems with developing the Su-57's engines, making them unreliable. Current Su-57s in operation are equipped with older engines, and in 2014, before walking away from a deal to help fund development of the Su-57, the Indian government expressed concerns over the engine's reliability. Russia hopes to sweep away these issues with a new engine designated Izdalai 30 and projected to be equipped on the Su-57 in the mid-2020s. However, this was before Russia was sanctioned by the world and cut off from critical technology supplies. The current fate of the planned engine upgrade is unknown. When it comes to engines, the F-22 is simply more reliable, with over 180 of the aircraft in operation for over a decade, while the Su-57 struggles with older engines and a planned upgrade that might never materialize. If Russia were to solve the engine issue, though, the Su-57 may outclass the F-22 in power, if not speed, due to the size difference. But a fighter is nothing without its weapons, so what kind of heat is each plane packing, and who's really bringing the smoke? The Su-57 has two tandem main internal weapon bays that run along the entire length of the body of the aircraft, and two side weapon bays for smaller missiles or bombs. Designed as a multi-role fighter, the Su-57 can strike surface targets with ease, packing the 550-pound KAB-250 or an 1,100-pound KAB-500 precision-guided bomb in its main bay. It can also carry the KH-38M air-to-ground missile, the KH-35U anti-ship missile, and the KH-58 USHK anti-radiation missile for striking enemy radar arrays, and the KH-59 Mark II cruise missile, though all of these in very limited quantities. However, if stealth is not a concern, the plane has 6 external hardpoints that can fit most Russian fighter-capable bombs and missiles. The KH-47M2 Kinzhal hypersonic air-to-ground missile is also being developed especially for the Su-57 and meant to fit within the dimensions of the plane's internal weapon base. However, if going up against the F-22, the Su-57 will bring 4 beyond visual range air-to-air missiles with a range of up to 120 miles and 2 shorter-range air-to-air missiles in its side weapon base. The F-22 has 3 internal weapon bays laid out in a different configuration from the Su-57. Its main bay is housed at the bottom of the fuselage, with 2 smaller bays directly on the sides of the fuselage and aft of the engine intakes. Up against a Su-57, the F-22 can carry 6 beyond visual range AIM-120 AMRAAMs and 1 AIM-9 Sidewinder in each bay. This gives the F-22 a significant 3-missile advantage over the Su-57, but this is hardly a surprise. The F-22 was designed specifically to take out enemy aircraft, while the Su-57 was designed to be a general-purpose machine capable of hitting both air and ground targets. The F-22 can also strike ground targets with the replacement of its 4 main bay launchers with 2 bomb racks that can each carry 1 1,000-pound or 4 250-pound bombs. The plane can also carry GPS-capable weapons, such as the Joint Direct Attack Munition, but it lacks the targeting pod required to self-designate targets for laser-guided bombs. Like the Su-57, the F-22 is equipped with external hardpoints for when stealth is not a priority, and it has 4 hardpoints rated at 5,000 pounds each. For a good old-fashioned knife fight in the sky, the F-22 carries the M61A2 Vulcan 20mm cannon and is equipped with 480 rounds meant for half-second bursts. The pilot's heads-up display projects a radar projection of the cannon's fire path when the weapon is in use to dramatically increase accuracy. The Su-57, meanwhile, is equipped with a 9A1 4071K 30mm autocannon with 150 rounds. While it has less rounds to fire, the 30mm cannon will provide a significant advantage if a hit is scored. And given the Su-57's incredible maneuverability, the odds of a hit are good. In terms of firepower, the F-22 takes the cake for air-to-air combat, even if it would do well to stay out of the dogfight range of the Su-57. However, the Su-57 is easier to configure for ground strike missions, making it more flexible. But all that smoke means nothing if you can't even detect what you're supposed to be aiming at. So how do the two planes compare in radar and avionics? The F-22 is a champion of sensor fusion, where it gathers data from all onboard systems, filters it for relevancy, and presents it to the pilot for greatly enhanced situational awareness, while lowering his workload. It can even receive data from other platforms to add to its tactical picture. It's equipped with the Sanders General Electric AN/ALR-94 electronic warfare system, Martin Marinetta AN/AAR-56 infrared and ultraviolet missile launch detector, Westinghouse Texas Instruments AN/APG-77 active electronically scanned array radar, and TRW Communication Navigation Identification Suite. It has over 30 antennas blended into the wings and fuselage to give the airplane complete all-around radar warning receiver coverage. This system can reduce its radar emissions to a confined narrow beam, down to 2 degrees in azimuth and elevation, exceeding over 250 miles in range and greatly increasing the plane's stealth by limiting excess electronic noise. In other words, if you take a shot at the Raptor, it's going to immediately know trouble is on the way. The system can even be used for a passive detection system that can search for targets and even provide lock-on for weapons at a classified range. The APG-77 radar equipped on the Raptor has a low observable active aperture, electronically scanned antenna that can track multiple targets while conducting scans in any weather condition. The Raptor can also focus its radar to overload enemy sensors in electronic attack configuration, degrading the effectiveness of enemy radar and increasing the survivability of fellow Raptors in formation. To reduce the chance of interception or degradation, the APG-77 changes frequency over 1,000 times a second and has an estimated range of 125 to 150 miles for a target with the profile radar cross-section of a Su-57. Not good news for the Russian fighter. Head-on, the Raptor is likely capable of targeting a Su-57 at just over 30 miles. By narrowing its beam, however, the APG-77 can increase this range by approximately 100 miles. Its 2 Hughes Common Integrated Processors are each capable of processing up to 10.5 billion instructions per second, making the F-22 one of the smartest planes in the sky. In fact, its avionics are so robust that the F-22 has threat detection and identification capabilities similar to the RC-135 rivet joint. However, its radar is less powerful than dedicated signals intelligence and threat detection platforms. This capability, however, allows the F-22 to designate targets for Allied aircraft, making the F-22 not just lethal on its own, but lending its lethality to 4th-generation aircraft who can fire weapons from outside the threat envelope an F-22 is currently operating inside of. In effect, the F-22 can grant friendly aircraft pseudo-stealth capabilities through its big brains, giving the enemy one hell of a headache to worry about. The Su-57 is Russia's first attempt at achieving sensor fusion. To manage its various electronic systems, the Su-57 is equipped with an information management system developed by GRPZ. The plane is equipped with an N036 AESA radar system and an L402 Himalayas electronic countermeasure system. Its radar is configured across 3 platforms with a traditional nose-mounted radar and 2 cheek-mounted radars that greatly increase angular coverage. It also allows a pilot to guide a missile to target without having to point its nose at it, a significant advantage in close-quarters combat. 2 N036L-1-01 L-band transceivers are mounted on each wing's leading edge flaps and used for friend or foe identification, but can also be configured for electronic warfare and used to degrade enemy radar, albeit at significantly less efficiency than the F-22. It's also equipped with a redundant radio telephone system and encrypted data exchange capabilities between itself and other aircraft. However, the largest difference between the 2 aircraft is the inclusion of the 101 KSV infrared search and track system on the Su-57. While the F-22 lacks any such capability, often touted as a stealth killer, ISRT systems allow an aircraft to search for and target enemy aircraft by their heat signatures. This heat comes not just from the engines but from the body of the plane, thanks to friction it experiences during supersonic flight. While the F-22 lacks ISRT capabilities, it's also designated to fly cooler at faster speeds than the Su-57, and with engine outlets that dramatically lower its infrared signature. Thus, the Su-57's ISRT will still have some difficulties targeting an F-22, and its effective range will be lowered considerably. Even so, this feature still gives the Su-57 an advantage in close-quarters combat. So, which is the superior aircraft? The F-22 takes the cake by a long shot. It's without question the world's premier fighter aircraft, with the most advanced avionics of any non-classified fighter in operation today. Its radar lacks the angular coverage of the Su-57 but can detect even stealthy targets at longer ranges compared to the Su-57, and more importantly provide good lock for weapons at increased ranges as well. With an increased number of air-to-air missiles, the F-22 has more chances to shoot a Su-57 out of the sky as well, another significant advantage. Yet, the Su-57 has the advantage in close quarters, and an F-22 pilot would do well to ensure he keeps a healthy distance between himself and the Su-57. But ultimately, this is a minor advantage, as the F-22 is simply built to not just be lethal on its own, but operate within a larger network of weapons and friendly platforms. This is a capability the Russians lack, and the US military remains the most networked armed force in the world. This means that it's not just the F-22 that's lethal to a Su-57, but a whole host of support platforms, all using the F-22's targeting and tracking data to guide their own weapons to target. Not only can the F-22 win a fight on its own, but it can invite all its other buddies to that fight as well, leaving the Su-57 pilot frightfully alone. However, ultimately the F-22 is superior for one single reason. It's an operational aircraft, and the Su-57 is not. If war were to break out between the two nations, it's highly unlikely an F-22 would ever meet a Su-57 in battle, given that there are only 6 non-testing models in operation, while the Russian Air Force would have to contend with over 180 Raptors. East Ukraine, March 2023. Anton huffed and puffed, reaching the truck a second before the driver threw it into gear, hauling himself up in the back just in time. All around him, similar trucks were already in motion or waiting with idling engines, their drivers yelling at the rushing soldiers to hurry up and load in. As if to punctuate the point, there was a high-pitched whine in the distance, followed by an explosive blast. Russian artillery was in range and opening up. This wasn't the first time he had to retreat during the course of a 13-month war for his country, but this was perhaps the most painful retreat. For over a year, Ukraine and Russia had slugged it out in a bloody battle for eastern Ukraine. Both sides had advanced and retreated under the weight of each other's offensives. Toward the end of last summer, though, Ukraine had made its greatest gains, liberating the city of Kherson in late September. It felt as if the tide of the war had finally shifted. And then the U.S. midterm elections came around. In a wholly unprecedented turn of events, a slew of isolationist politicians had been voted into office. The House of Representatives had quickly put forth a measure to end U.S. membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, believing it to be a waste of resources when a real threat to America was in the Pacific, namely China. Pressure on the Senate led to landmark legislature, and with the stroke of a pen, the United States was no longer a member of NATO. This had direct implications for Ukraine's war against Russia. With no more investment in Europe, the United States was no longer as interested in hemming in Russian aggression, and thus funding for the Ukrainian armed forces quickly dried up. Along with the money came an end to millions of rounds of ammunition, HARM anti-radar missiles, new artillery, and of course, the vaunted HIMARS system, which had enabled Ukraine's first and only major offensive at the end of August last year. Ukraine was now a European problem, and Europe's support for the Ukrainian armed forces was a fraction of what it had enjoyed from the United States. The new slew of American politicians represented a shift in attitude from the American taxpayers. Russia was Europe's problem, Problem is, Europe was ill-prepared to deal with the problem, and Anton and his comrades were suffering for it. It was hard to tell which had been the most devastating for his country's war effort, the lack of direct material support or the lack of intelligence support. Before, his country had enjoyed the wealth of information offered by America's vast intelligence-gathering apparatus, everything from human intelligence sources to satellite and electronic intercepts, all of it feeding targeting data to eliminate Russian VIPs and intelligence preventing Russian surprise assaults or reinforcements. Ukraine had enjoyed a nearly real-time view on Russian movements. Now that intelligence was reduced to a trickle, the army was largely fighting blind. But the lack of material support hurt too. Surviving HIMARS units no longer had ammunition, and work was being done to try to convert them to fire more available and less capable unguided rocket munitions. The supply of manned portable air defense weapons had all but evaporated, leaving the frontline troops vulnerable to air attack as they once were at the start of the war. Russian tanks can now operate with greatly reduced fear from anti-tank missile threats, as the US had provided the bulk of Ukraine's anti-armor capabilities via its Javelin ATMs. For Anton, the decision for the US to withdraw from NATO and from Europe itself meant he was in retreat once more, but this time it felt much more final. NATO headquarters, Brussels, Belgium. The Ukrainians were taking a beating, now in general retreat across the east. Major General Alex Tuvich shook his head sadly, reading the intelligence reports in his hand. The US was still tasking satellites, ELINT, and human sources in the war in Ukraine, but it just wasn't sharing that information anymore. A damn stupid move on the politician's behalf, thought the general to himself. With a sigh, he fed the report to the Specialized Disposal Unit for sensitive documents. It was the last piece of hardware in what was his former office inside NATO headquarters as a special attaché to the organization, which had lasted for 8 decades, but was now in serious jeopardy of collapse. He waited to confirm the disposal unit did its job. With a hum of energy, it flash incinerated the document, leaving behind only ashes. He knew its job was done when he could smell the slight aroma of burning paper. He wouldn't bother sending an aide for the device. The Euros could have it, along with his empty office. General Tuvich stood and took in one last look at what was once one of the cornerstones of American global strategy, then turned his back on the office and 80 years of highly successful foreign policy and walked out the door. He was met by his aide and driver. There was a waiting U.S. Air Force passenger plane at the nearby military airfield, which would return him to the U.S. via Britain, as America and the U.K. still maintained a security alliance. U.S. forces and bases there weren't being deactivated as they were across mainland Europe. As he passed within a few doors of one of the General Assembly meeting rooms, he could hear the Latvian representative practically screaming at his NATO partners. He didn't blame them. Since the U.S. announced its withdrawal from the alliance, Russia had reinforced its eastern flank along the Baltics. It was all but a certainty that Russia would attempt to intimidate the breakaway Soviet republics into returning to the fold. He wondered if they would actually use force, though, and what the hell Europe would do about it if they did. As he turned the corner, he was greeted by Lieutenant Colonel Beaumont Deschamps, one of France's representatives, here at Brussels headquarters. The two had enjoyed a close working relationship, and he quite liked the man. He barely even held the fact that he was French against him anymore. For his part, Deschamps ignored that Tuvich's favorite meals typically included hamburgers of some sort. Deschamps fell in alongside Tuvich, speaking in a thick Alsatian French accent. "Your government could have at least left us with logistical support." "I agree, damn foolish of the politicians, but..." Tuvich shrugged his shoulders. Americans got tired of paying the bills for European security. Deschamps bristled at the comment, yet he couldn't deny there was at least some truth to this. His own nation was only 0.07% away from meeting the alliance's minimum funding goal of 2% GDP, and had only increased spending in recent years under intense pressure from the US. What is that American expression? "The merd is soon to hit the fan"? Major General Alex Tuvich nodded solemnly. Yes, my friend, the merd is in fact about to hit the fan. Satsa, Estonia. 12 Mi-8 helicopters of the Russian aerospace forces crossed the border into Estonia, flying just barely over the rooftops of the neighboring town of Satsa. The helicopters set down at pre-planned positions around the western perimeter of the town, disgorging their squads of Russian paratroopers. A few minutes later, a force of Russian T-90s and BTR-80s overran the border police checkpoint, smashing through the flimsy wooden barricade. There was a brief exchange of gunfire with some Estonian border troops, but within 6 hours, the small town was firmly under the control of the Russian military. From the town square, the Russians had hung their country's flag. 10 Downing Street, United Kingdom. The British Prime Minister did her best to hide her concern. Arrayed before her on multiple screens were the leaders or representatives of the remaining members of the NATO alliance. The emergency conference had been called immediately upon reports of the first Russian troops crossing into Estonian territory. In the last 6 hours, the Russians had secured the small town, and the new satellite reconnaissance seemed to indicate that they were digging into defensive positions. Estonia had attempted to fly several drones over the area, but they had all been shot down, so live intelligence was out of the question. However, it didn't seem as if the Russians had any intention of advancing their attack. The Prime Minister realized she'd been asked a question and snapped out of her internal mental review. "I'm sorry, what was that?" The representative from the Estonian government was on the main screen, looking understandably frustrated. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you again. Will Britain honor its commitment to NATO's NRF?" That was a question with a million implications. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. The fate of Europe in the 21st century very much depended on her answer. NATO's response force and very rapid response force had been set up to deal with exactly this type of Russian incursion. It was well known that for at least a decade, Russia's Vladimir Putin had toyed with the idea of a fait accompli attack against NATO. The seizure of a single meaningless village somewhere along the Baltics, not enough to warrant full-scale war in normal circumstances, but enough to test the NATO alliance. If NATO hesitated, the entire concept of mutual defense collapsed and the alliance would inevitably splinter, exactly as Putin wanted. Despite his catastrophic setbacks in Ukraine, which were now being reversed, America's exit from the alliance had given him exactly the opportunity he'd been dreaming of. He didn't even wait for America to fully leave the continent. European Command still had several dozen planes waiting to be loaded with equipment in airfields across Germany. The PM looked over at the screen with the Turkish representative. Turkey had been striding a fine line between Europe and Russia for years now, but had so far seemed to be committed to the alliance in regards to assisting Ukraine. However, the incursion into Estonia had put Turkey in a position where it finally had to decide who it really wanted to be friends with, and faced the prospect of fighting Russia without US aid. Well, she could already see the answer on the man's stony face. It wasn't that NATO without America wasn't a match for the Russian military, it's that the US provided the very backbone of what a modern army needs to win a fight: transportation, logistical support, and special mission aircraft. U.S. firepower was considerable and nice, but it was the loss of U.S. logistics and support assets that made a response to Russia's incursion difficult. The alliance had scrambled to shore up its deficiencies since the U.S. announced its surprise exit, and the response and very fast response forces were at least fully equipped. But those couldn't win a war on their own. They were meant to deter a war, not stop one in progress. Russia had called NATO's bluff, and without U.S. air power and intelligence immediately available to the alliance, it would take weeks to coordinate an effective response from the varying military powers. Britain was having trouble even keeping its current ships fully manned, and had already cannibalized a few vessels of their crews in the last 10 years just to keep others operational. Germany struggled to fully equip its commitment to NATO's response force, having to borrow equipment from other units to do so, and its air force hadn't been considered fully ready for combat for years now due to maintenance and logistical problems. She scanned the faces of the NATO representatives on the screens before her. The French president had a grim but determined look on his face. He had already pledged French support for the NRF, and then again, of course he did. France seemed to be one of the few powers in Europe whose military was ready for such a war, she thought sadly. The Polish representative looked equally grim and determined. Poland was fiercely opposed to Russian aggression, having suffered the brunt of it for centuries. One of her American military contacts had lamented that leaving Poland had for the U.S. military like been leaving a dear friend behind in a bad situation. But other faces she looked at didn't share the same hardened resolve. Turkey, Hungary, Finland, and Sweden, the two newest members who had confidently joined the alliance after the invasion of Ukraine, didn't look ready to honor their commitment to NATO's NRF. Committing the UK would tip the balance, throwing NATO into a full-scale war. Not doing so meant Russia won, and NATO would come apart at the seams as it lost all credibility. All because of one damn village built too close to the Russian border. Clearing her throat, the Britain Prime Minister prepared herself to make history. Gentlemen and ladies, after much consideration, I believe it is in Britain's and Europe's best interest if the British Armed Forces. Things in the southern region of Ukraine are about to go from bad to worse. Vladimir Putin has just declared martial law in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. This likely is a desperate attempt to maintain control in the regions, but also has a much darker and sinister purpose. What is happening in these Ukrainian states is reminiscent of Nazi Germany, as Putin is literally trying to change the ethnic makeup of the region. Let's examine what martial law is, why Putin has implemented it in illegally annexed parts of Ukraine, and what it could mean for the future. However, before we dive in, imagine this haunting scenario. Overnight, your freedom is completely revoked. You can't leave your house without permission, and you have to support an enemy in their war efforts. Every day is a worse nightmare than the last. You step outside of your house. The streets are desolate as the sun begins to set over the distant hills. With everything that's been going on, you forgot to buy bread this morning, and without it, your family will starve. You look down the street to make sure no one's there and run down an alleyway. On the other side of the street is your local bakery. You dart out onto the main road where you hear a voice scream, "Halt!" You freeze, knowing that if you take another step, you could be shot. 3 Russian soldiers walk up to you, rifles slung across their shoulders. "What are you doing out after curfew?" One of the soldiers asks. You explain that you forgot to buy bread and your family is starving. The soldier just laughs. They have no sympathy. "Well, if you're headed to the bakery, you must have money on you. And all money should be going to pay the soldiers who are fighting for your freedom, like us." You stare at the soldier with pleading eyes. You ask them to show mercy, as you have 2 little kids and a wife at home. They just continue to laugh. One of the soldiers grabs your arms and holds them behind your back. Another searches your pockets and finds your wallet. They take the money out of it, throw the wallet to the ground, and just for good measure, punch you in the stomach. "Now go back home and don't let us find you out after curfew again," the Russian soldier says before spitting on you. The soldiers walk away laughing. This is what your country has turned into since Russia invaded. And now that martial law is in place, the military can do anything they want. This is the current reality in parts of southern Ukraine. But what exactly is martial law, and what does it allow Putin to do? If we think back to several months ago when the war had just started, the goals of Vladimir Putin were vague at best and the ravings of a lunatic at worst. Just to recap how we got to where we are today, Putin proclaimed he wanted to reestablish a former Russian empire. He spewed lies and propaganda, stating that southern Ukraine had been stolen from Russia and that the citizens living there wanted to be reincorporated back to the motherland. Some people living in Ukraine did want this, but the vast majority enjoyed the independence and freedom from the oppressive regime of Russia and the democratic nature of the government. This brings us to the real reasons why Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Yes, he wanted to form a new Russian empire. However, it was the democratic nature of Ukraine and the country becoming more westernized that actually led Putin to invade. He knew that if Ukraine became part of the European Union, NATO, or allied itself with the West, it could threaten his rule in Russia. Paranoia is a common trait among ruthless dictators because if citizens realized that their lives could be better if they had a say in the government and then decided to start a revolution, dictators tend to lose their lives. Putin probably always has this thought in the back of his mind, and as Ukraine became more and more westernized, Putin felt that he had to attack to save himself. It's not entirely clear which former Russian empire Putin wants to reestablish, however. When the former Soviet Union collapsed, Russia lost a lot of territory in Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. However, if Putin is hoping to reform the Tsarist Empire of 1914, then there would be a lot more conflict in the future. It's important to remember that the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions were illegally annexed by Russia. In September, a staged referendum was conducted where voters were met at the polls by armed Russian soldiers who held them at gunpoint until they voted for their states to be annexed by Russia. That's right, the Ukrainian people living in the annexed regions of Ukraine were given a choice to vote for their homeland to be incorporated into Russia or die. There's little doubt that many Ukrainians were killed during the referendum for refusing to vote for annexation. The United Nations and the majority of the world do not recognize Russia's authority in these regions. However, this doesn't matter to Putin. Russia has occupied southern Ukraine for several months now, so the question becomes, why did Putin declare martial law now? Like many of Vlad's decisions, this one doesn't seem to be completely thought out. Martial law expands the power of the military and law enforcement agents in the region. Occupied Ukraine really didn't have much freedom to begin with. All Putin is doing by declaring martial law is giving a different name to what's already been happening. Under the umbrella of martial law, the military can impose curfews, restrict freedoms, take civilian property, enlist people into the army, and force residents to rebuild any destroyed infrastructure. Again, these things are already happening in the occupied territories. However, since Moscow hasn't declared martial law since the Soviet Union, this may be Putin's first official move to bring annexed parts of Ukraine into his Russian empire. But again, the question is, why now? What does Putin get out of declaring martial law? Putin has not just initiated martial law in Ukraine, but in the rest of Russia as well. However, there are different tiers of martial law depending on where you live. In Russia, Putin has called for basic martial law, which means nothing is really going to change, but citizens should be prepared to aid the military in its war effort by working in factories or enlisting in the army if asked. In southern Ukraine, the martial law is instated and labeled as maximum readiness, which means that the people in those regions will be asked to make sacrifices immediately to help Russia fight against the rest of Ukraine. Putin has continually said that the reason he needed to implement martial law is that Ukraine's government and its Western allies refused to accept the result of the annexation referendum as legitimate, which of course they weren't. Putin declared in one speech, "As is well known, the regime in Kyiv has refused to recognize the will of the people. We are trying to resolve difficult, large-scale challenges on providing security to Russia and protecting the future of Russia, defending our people." What it really comes down to is that Russia has suffered a number of significant defeats in the war against Ukraine. Most recently, this has happened in the battle to control Lyman, where Ukrainian forces humiliated the Russian military by holding their ground and forcing the Russian army into full retreat. It's also important to note that Ukraine still controls parts of Donbas, where Putin has declared martial law, which means that the citizens living under Russian military control will be asked to not only support Russia, but fight alongside them as well. Putin needed to declare martial law so that the military had the authority to use citizens as resources of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia however they deemed fit to defeat Ukrainian forces. Many Ukrainians have fled the Russian-occupied regions in the south. However, not everyone was so lucky. Martial law will give the Russian military the authority to compel any civilian under their control to aid the Russian war effort, which is a breach of the Geneva Convention. But Vladimir Putin has no concern over the proper conduct of war or basic human rights, so he's more than happy to formally increase his military's authority in southern Ukraine to allow them to use Ukrainian citizens however they see fit. The crazy thing is that by instituting martial law, Putin may be trying to mobilize a Ukrainian-style territorial defense force made up of Russian officers and part-time reservists, which would be supplemented by civilians. The martial law also allows the military to have greater control over who comes in and out of each region. There's currently a 7-day ban on civilians entering any of the annexed regions. However, since Russia doesn't control all of the territory in the 4 regions, this ban on movement will be extremely hard to enforce. The martial law declared by Putin also has a propaganda component to it. By stating he has the authority to modify the way things are being run in southern Ukraine, he is reinforcing the false fact that there were elections in the region and that the people living in the region are now happily a part of Russia. The decisions that Putin is making are all part of the narrative that he's just trying to do what's best for the Russian people. However, the rest of the world isn't falling for it, and it seems that Russian citizens might be losing faith in old Vladi and his regime. The implementation of martial law will likely be used to secure more resources for Russia. One main aspect of martial law is that the military can now repurpose any business or manufacturing center that they need. For example, metalworking factories that once produced materials for infrastructure can be repurposed into building weapons and war vehicles. Companies that procure natural resources such as fossil fuels or minerals can be forced to give their supply directly to the military. Basically, martial law allows the Russian government to convert any and all parts of its economy into a war machine. However, the most atrocious part of the martial law implemented by Putin is it will allow for easier deportation of certain populations out of Ukraine and into Russia. This is where things get a little too close to how Nazi Germany acted in World War II. It's no secret that Putin wants to enact mass deportation of certain Ukrainian populations to parts of Russia. The reason he wants to do this is to change the ethnic majority in the region. In Putin's eyes, Ukraine and much of Eastern Europe should still be part of the Russian Empire. By deporting problematic people who claim to have a culture separate from Russia's, Putin can create a more homogeneous state that's made up of people who are loyal to him. Putin's regime has claimed they're only using force to temporarily resettle people. However, the fact that certain people are being targeted for deportation strongly suggests there is a much more sinister agenda at work. Experts estimate that somewhere between 900,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainians have been deported from their homeland into Russia. It's not entirely clear where these people are being sent or what they're being forced to do, but there's a chance they're being put in camps where they're required to aid the Russian military by working in factories or dangerous mining operations. Obviously, this looks really bad for Putin and his regime, so they released a statement shortly before announcing that martial law would be coming, saying that the residents were free to evacuate from southern Ukraine and the government would not only help them relocate in any part of Russia, but would provide housing vouchers as well. This was a thinly veiled distraction from what was about to happen. Every free-thinking individual knew it was just more propaganda to make Putin look sympathetic, as his military forced people onto transports and sent them deep into Russia. Martial law also allows Putin to send more troops to annexed regions of Ukraine without admitting he is losing the war. The Russian people are becoming more and more disheartened. Those who believe in the cause are starting to wane. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled the country to make sure they're not conscripted into the military. Putin is losing the support of his own people. However, by declaring martial law, he can ensure that the military keeps Russian citizens in line while also giving him a reason to send more troops to Ukraine. For propaganda purposes, Putin says that martial law will help ensure the ideals of Russia are being upheld in the annexed regions. But the more likely reason why Putin needs more troops in Ukraine is he's afraid he'll lose the war. This also answers the question of why now. Russian forces have been defeated and pushed back several times in recent months. A war that was only supposed to last a month or two is quickly approaching a year. Putin will never admit it, but in the back of his mind, he is likely scared. If Russia loses the war in Ukraine, or if the war gets drawn out for much longer, the people of Russia will see Vladimir Putin as being weak. There's a good chance if this happens, he'll be overthrown and executed by his own citizens. Therefore, Putin must maintain as much control and influence as possible. He's doing this by using his military and giving them more power through martial law. This will force businesses and defense contractors to align with his goals and provide him with the soldiers and resources necessary to continue fighting in Ukraine. It'll also allow Putin to not only control the populations in the annexed regions more easily, but will also allow him to control his citizens at home, especially if they start to become unruly or try to start a revolution against him. Putin and the rest of his regime believe that enacting martial law across Russia and southern Ukraine is a show of strength. However, many think it indicates how desperate they've become. The fact that Vladimir Putin needs to position his military in a way that ensures his citizens will continue to support him in his war effort is a telling sign that things are going very badly for him. The desperate tactics are less strategic and more of an indication that Putin and his allies are losing control. The sad part is that martial law will likely cause more death and despair in occupied Ukraine. As Putin becomes more desperate, he'll continue to escalate his tactics to ensure he remains in power and the war can continue on. However, if Putin ever loses control or Russia is defeated, it will not only be the end of Putin's reign, but likely his life as well. Ukraine is on the march. The Eastern European country has turned the tables on the Russian invaders and is taking back conquered territory, largely thanks to state-of-the-art NATO weapons that have easily routed Russia's outdated gear. Vladimir Putin has raged at NATO nations threatening nuclear war, but he has no answer for their weapons. Until now, because winter is coming and it's about to get cold. Europe gets a large percentage of its natural gas from Russia and relies on it to heat the country in the cold northern European winter. How much of its gas? In 2021, natural gas made up just over a quarter of Germany's energy usage, and over half of that was imported from Russia, much of it through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which runs over 750 miles from Russia to Germany through the Baltic Sea. Russia has frequently used the pipeline as leverage, shutting off gas in July. In September, a massive leak in the pipeline was thought to be sabotage, although Putin blamed NATO. But is a far worse crisis coming? The crisis in Ukraine began at the tail end of winter 2022, and through spring, summer, and fall, the pipeline gave Putin relatively little leverage over Europe. But temperatures in Germany can get brutally cold in winter, and with several long cold months ahead, Putin could attempt to starve out the country, and NATO as a whole, by cutting off the gas. This would mean much more than just people bundling up. Gas prices would skyrocket with limited supply. Those on fixed incomes might not even be able to heat their homes, which would lead to an inevitable death toll. The hope for Russian hardliners is that the German people would see their own country suffer, support for Ukraine would waver, and NATO might decide it's best just to let Putin have his way. But Germany has a plan. The people of Europe have known a possible crisis was coming for a long time. After all, Putin's belligerence didn't start with the February invasion. He's been slicing off pieces of Ukraine, Georgia, and other countries for years. While he stayed clear of NATO lines so far, his aggressive behavior made a conflict feel inevitable, and so Germany has been working on a big plan to wean itself off Russian natural gas entirely by 2024. They want to both eliminate their dependency on Russia and replace this energy with more sustainable alternatives. But this isn't going to be an easy task. The country has taken some major steps already to build up a reserve store of gas before the crisis truly hits. While many in the country are looking to get off of natural gas altogether, that's a long-range project, and they don't have a long time. So a big part of the plan is to find ways to seamlessly replace Russian gas. They've already started by leasing 4 floating storage and regasification units that will be able to take important natural gas and convert it from liquid to the gas they need to power the country. These 4 massive facilities should be able to handle up to 6.25 billion cubic meters each, and they're set to be located in Wilhelmshaven, Brunsbüttel, Stade, and Lubmin. But where will these gas supplies actually come from? The country has existing arrangements with Qatar, Australia, and the United States, but the biggest new source of natural gas may be further north, Canada. Canada's tar sands are a massive source of natural gas, and when a pipeline with the United States was scuttled in recent years, it meant that more of that gas would be available for export off the continent. Germany has good relations with Canada, a fellow NATO member, and would likely be able to avoid price gouging by working with them. But one can't rely on gas alone. To combat the shortage, Germany might be going old school. The country hurriedly passed a law to bring oil-field and coal-fired power plants back online in the event that the gas reserves get perilously low. The government hopes this could add 10 gigawatts of reserve capacity to the system, and the current arrangement allows for this to run until the end of March 2024. But relatively few of these plants are still available. And while this isn't a long-term solution, it might just be enough to prevent brutal blackouts in the dead of winter. And from old school to ultra-modern, another solution might offer hope. Just when they thought they were out, Putin pulls them back in. Germany moved to shut down its 3 nuclear power plants not long ago due to fears over potential accidents and other environmental concerns. While many say that nuclear power is far safer than the alternative, the concerns weren't assuaged, so the plan was to shut them down at the end of 2022. But now Germany's grid operators are researching whether the plants can be kept going longer without investing in new fuel rods. While these nuclear power plants only account for around 6% of Germany's overall power supply, they could be key in bridging the gap. If a long-term crisis emerges, there might be pressure to build new nuclear plants. But that's a massive infrastructure project that definitely wouldn't help in winter 2022. And the clock is ticking. Germany's current goal is to fill its gas storage facilities to 95% of their expected level by the start of November before the need ramps up. It's likely prices will go up as demand does, and Germany's stores are its best hope to get through winter. Demand varies each year based on the weather, but it's likely that the country will need everything it can get, especially if people panic and use more than average. Nah, when has that ever happened? Hey, does anyone have some spare 2020 toilet paper, by the way? But none of this comes cheap. A big part of the plan is about funding, and that means pain in a lot of ways. It starts with a bailout for Uniper, the country's largest Russian gas importer. They've essentially been cut off from their key source of income, and the government needs their help to fulfill the nation's energy needs. So they've cut a deal for a bailout of 15 billion euros in exchange for a 30% stake in the company. This should hopefully be enough. But they're also ready to step in again with a bigger bailout if losses get too big. This might be controversial, like bailouts always are, but the government sees Uniper as an essential partner. But it's nowhere near as controversial as this next part. Remember when George H.W. Bush said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then raised taxes? Ask Bill Clinton how that worked out. The public hates taxes, and any government that raises them is likely to face some fierce blowback. But that hasn't stopped Germany's Olaf Scholz from doing what needs to be done. Major costs are coming, and he's responded by passing 2 new taxes, one to fund the higher cost of procuring the gas and one to fund the efforts to fill the storage facilities ahead of schedule. It's estimated this will cost the average German family about 480 euros a year, but it'll vary as the tax will be applied to energy bills. The taxes kicked in on October 1st and are expected to stay long-term, but to alleviate public anger, there is a limited sales tax break being introduced at the same time. But all this may not be enough. Germany has planned well for a long winter without Russian gas, and they know they could still run into trouble. That's why the government has asked people to reduce their personal gas consumption by up to 20% to prevent a gas emergency. But can the average person actually do this? In some cases, it might be as simple as doing what Dad said when you wanted to turn the thermostat up. Just put on a sweater. By reducing the thermostat to the point where it's still bearable but you need to put on a few extra layers, it might be possible to shave a few points off the budget and shave some money off your gas bill. But one big factor possibly stands in the way. In many ways, Germany's at the mercy of Mother Nature here. The winter may be mild, in which case the gas needs might be below normal. Or it might be a standard winter where Germany's stores of natural gas and other supplies can carry them through. But the trend has been toward more extreme weather over the last few years. Remember the polar vortex that seems to float through every year now? And in a situation where the temperatures drop well below freezing for an extended period, Germany could find itself working through that strategic gas reserve extremely quickly and entering a gas emergency. Currently, long-range weather indicators are that the winter will be average in temperatures but low on snow, which would be good news. But the polar vortex is unstable and could collapse, leading to a cold and brutal winter in Central Europe. And that's where things get tricky. The government's hoping to ride out the crisis through voluntary rationing and alternative energy sources, but if demand for gas is higher than expected, it's possible the country would have to go to mandatory rationing. And that would fall to their network regulator, NNetA, which is already collecting data from thousands of companies. The goal is to avoid a total power grid shutdown, which would affect millions of people in their homes and could lead to countless, primarily from the poor and elderly, freezing to death. And in order to prevent that, it's the companies that'll have to take a hit. Germany's emergency response to a gas shortage might ironically look a lot like the response to another crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. If things get bad enough, the country might decide to save gas by eliminating large non-residential settings from the power grid. That means that workplaces might go remote again, with people firing up the Zoom chat. Schools might go remote as well, although that would be likely much later in the process. Non-essential businesses like restaurants and retail that use a lot of power might be ordered to close as well until the gas crisis alleviates. The regulators will carefully balance 6 factors, including the company's gas footprint, how much damage shutting down would cause, and how long it would take to start things up again. And so, Germany's long, cold winter might get even quieter as people return to hunkering down in their homes and the city centers go silent. But is this likely to happen? If you ask Olaf Scholz, Germany is well prepared. There are other emergency contingencies that the country could take, like emergency imports from the Netherlands or Norway. While this could be costly, the cost of a gas crisis would be much higher, especially if it meant shutting down sectors of the economy. And while Scholz was elected as a liberal leader pushing for sustainable energy, this potential crisis has turned him into a bit of a gas hawk. He's now pushing for a pipeline from the other side of Europe, starting in Spain and making its way over to Germany and other countries. If you listen to him, the future sounds bright. But in other ways, it's already getting dark. If you're looking for ominous signs, look no further than the lights on German skylines. The view from the cities was always stunning and usually cast in light to allow tourists to enjoy the landmarks even after dark. But now, people are visiting sites like Dresden's Riverside or Berlin's Central Cathedral, noticing the buildings are dark. This isn't any sort of federal order, it's likely either voluntary decisions or local ordinances as the cities try to conserve energy. While it's not a sign of a crisis just yet, it is definitely a sign that people are worried. And if dimming the lights now can prevent a long, dark winter, most Germans are likely to think it's worth it. But for now, all eyes are on Putin and the Nord Stream 2, as everyone in Europe hopes a perilous situation isn't about to get worse. With both Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 blown up, however, Germany is in even more peril than before, and many German citizens are looking forward to a winter of energy rationing. There's been no official announcement of rationing just yet, but it's almost an inevitability, given that transitioning to alternative energy suppliers or refiring decommissioned coal and petroleum power plants is going to take a lot of time. For its part, Russia is denying having anything to do with the pipeline explosions and is blaming it on bad maintenance, but it's clear to the world this is just another attempt by Putin to strong-arm the West into stopping support for Ukraine. No Instagram, TikTok, or Rocky films. These are some of the craziest consequences if Russia ruled the world. To understand a world where Russia is the dominant power, we first have to understand what it is that Russia wants today. The invasion of Ukraine might have come out of nowhere for many people, but the truth is that this invasion was all but inevitable. And you might be surprised to hear this, but the US and NATO are not blameless in this. Certainly, it was Putin's decision to attack Ukraine, but NATO has seen the possibility of a conflict like this ever since the early 2000s, when they were considering formally including the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania into NATO. Time and again, Russia had warned after the fall of the Soviet Union against NATO expansion, and time and again, NATO ignored those warnings as it continued to expand east and into former Soviet republics. To be clear, we're not arguing that this was wrong. People should be free to dictate their own fate, and the Baltic nations feared Russia and felt they'd be safer in NATO's hands. Obviously, time has proven them right. The inclusion of the Baltic countries, though, put NATO forces on the doorstep of Russia, and for a brief moment, the world held its collective breath. Would Russia invade in retaliation and kick off a major global conflict? Thankfully, Russia didn't, but it's important to understand that this was a very real possibility, and NATO knew it. Expanding the alliance all the way to Russia's border was a red line all parties involved knew could trigger a military response. Instead, the conflict was delayed by a decade, when in 2014, Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. 8 years later, with Ukraine undeterred from joining NATO and the EU, Russia invaded the country with the intent of conducting a regime change. Vladimir Putin has promised that he does not intend to annex the former Soviet Republic or hold on to any of its territory after the war is over. But given that Russia has lied about preparing for an invasion, then carrying out said invasion, and not targeting civilians, frankly, Putin can be trusted about as far as you can throw him at this point. But why was Ukraine ever worth invading in the first place? The Cold War might have ended in the West, but Russia has refused to admit defeat, and no one more so than Vladimir Putin, who still views his relationship with the West as a zero-sum game. There can only be one winner between Russia and NATO as far as he's concerned. This antagonism comes in large part from the shame of the Soviet collapse, but also from what has been perceived across much of Russia as the West infringing focusing on the Russian identity itself. The spread of Western liberal values into the country, such as gender equality, support for LGBTQ communities, and racial harmony, are seen by many conservative Russians as a direct attack on their identity as Russians. The West might have moved on from the Cold War social attitudes, but the Russians didn't, and the sting of their defeat in the Cold War only adds to their indignation at what they perceive to be the penetration of their society by Western institutions. This is due in part to extreme conservatism amongst a society that was walled off to the world for nearly 50 years, but also because Putin has used the intrusion of these Western values as a chance to create ultra-nationalist propaganda. Russians under Putin must stand strong against corrupting Western influence that still seeks to destroy Russia, again in the mind of Putin. And thus, by rejecting these values, Russians can strike a blow against the West. For the most part, it's not the Russians that want to reject these values, but they've been made to feel like they have to because of the vile propaganda levied against them for decades. If Putin's going to defeat the West, after all, he needs domestic support to remain high, especially when the cost of antagonizing the West has historically been crippling sanctions. Another reason for the hostility between Russia and the West, though, is the matter of Russia's national security. Russia sits at the far end of the European plain, a vast swath of flat country that's notoriously difficult to defend against invasion. That's why Russia has suffered terribly over the centuries from European invasions. If Russia is to remain secure, it needs to keep potential adversaries at arm's length, and that means keeping them off their doorstep. With NATO already on its northwest flank, allowing Ukraine to draw closer to NATO and the EU was strategically unacceptable for Russia. Again, NATO knew this and yet continued to flirt with the idea of Ukraine joining NATO on purpose. While there's no way to prove it, the invasion of Ukraine is exactly the scenario that NATO was hoping for, as it now gives the West a way to break Russia without directly attacking it. Sadly, the Ukrainians must bear the cost of Russia's defeat. So, what if Russia could achieve all of its foreign policy objectives? What would a world dominated by Russia look like? First, we have to stress this is going to be pure fiction. Russia is not powerful enough economically or militarily to achieve anything that we're about to lay out. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia has become an isolated hermit kingdom whose economy is shattered and military is incapable of winning a conflict against an exceptionally weaker opponent. So buckle up, because we're about to take a dive into Putin's mind and imagine a world where Santa Claus is real, fairies exist, and Russia is the world's dominant power. First, to become dominant, Russia has to neutralize the military, political, and economic influence of both the United States and China. A successful war against China is remotely possible for Russia. China's military might be big, but it still lags behind in modernity, and more importantly, it has no experience in modern combat. As poorly as the Russian military has performed in Ukraine, we can expect the Chinese military to perform even worse. But again, this is pure fantasy because, simply put, neither nation has the military might to completely neutralize the other. Instead, a war between Russia and China would drag on to become a multi-year stalemate where neither side makes much progress and both sides declare peace simply because the war has become so costly for them. Economically speaking, Russia has an even worse chance of neutralizing China, as its own economy is a fraction of China's, and shrinking. With the world blacklisting Russia since its invasion, it's lost any leverage it might have possessed over China. Both of those problems are only magnified exponentially when facing off against the United States. But the US has a third advantage: it wields far more political might than either Russia or China. The world currently exists largely under the leadership of the United States, who enjoys the benefits of having allies and strategic partnerships all over the world. But let's just say, somehow, the US and China are both militarily, politically, or economically subjugated by Russia. What now? First, we can expect Russia to export its model of authoritarianism around the world. There is nothing an autocrat like Vladimir Putin fears more than being removed from power, and Russia has a long history of violently removing rulers from power. Thus, to keep the world under Russia's yoke, we would see the end of the age of free, open media. Instead, news outlets would be nationalized exactly the same way they were inside the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. Information would be tightly controlled, and dissenting opinions violently suppressed. Those who defy the state would face steep fines or jail time. Though the more closely aligned with Russia a nation is, the more subversive an offender is seen as. Worse consequences such as death are not out of the question. Russia currently ranks 10th on the Global Impunity Index for killing of journalists, but that's hardly surprising for a country that sent assassins all the way to Britain to murder a defector who slandered Putin's regime. Modern Russia tightly controls information, and it's learned to be quite good at it. While a few independent media outlets do exist, a rapidly decreasing number ever since the Ukrainian invasion, most of Russia's media is nationalized and gets its talking points directly from the Kremlin. Russia is adept at hiding suppression of free speech, as laws meant to protect the people, such as the current law that promises up to 15 years in prison for anyone speaking about the truth of the Ukrainian invasion. Russia's enacted this law to supposedly combat misinformation that hurt national morale. The right to assembly, one of the West's most cherished values, is also technically non-existent in Russia. So while on paper you are allowed to stage protests, you must receive a permit to do so. Perhaps unsurprisingly, you're never going to get that permit to protest something the state doesn't want you protesting. Russia has the vague appearance of liberal values, but is in fact one of the world's most autocratic states. What's important though is maintaining the illusion to avoid full-blown dissent and revolution. And this is exactly what you could expect to see happening in your own country if Russia ruled the world. If you don't like what Russia's doing, you better keep it to yourself, because in a world dominated by Russia, your own government will punish you for speaking out. It happened during the Cold War, and it would happen again. To achieve this, Russia would install pro-Kremlin leaders around the world. Much like during the Soviet bloc days, you would still likely be allowed to vote, but only from a pool of candidates approved by your government, which itself would be handpicked by the Kremlin itself. Opposition candidates might even be allowed, much in the same way that they're allowed inside Russia today, but more often than not, these opposition candidates would meet with unfortunate ends. Many would suddenly be accused of tax fraud or similar crimes and imprisoned or disqualified from running for office, while others would simply be murdered. This was Putin's answer to the challenge from Boris Nemtsov, a Russian politician who publicly called for the public to march against Putin's government for his invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Nemtsov was shot by an unknown assailant as he crossed a bridge at 11:30 p.m. on February 27, 2015. Life under Russian global occupation, however, wouldn't be all bad, except for being constantly spied on and having no civil liberties. Unlike the Soviet Union, Putin's Russia is not communist and has fully embraced a free market. After all, it made Putin personally extremely rich, though much of that wealth has simply been stolen from oligarchs that dared to oppose Putin. You could expect to have much of the same luxuries you enjoy today, and the global economy would remain largely undisturbed. However, you can forget about social media apps like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Instead, you'd have the equivalent of their Chinese counterparts, heavily monitored and censored platforms where the government can and will punish you for producing material they find unacceptable for public decency. In both Russia and China's case, this happens to involve anything that goes against the official government position. Though thankfully, unlike China, Russia really has no problem with silly dances and K-pop boy bands, so you could still enjoy both. What the world would lose under Russian leadership is not so much its material prosperity, but its freedom of self-determination. The liberal values that Western democracies are built on would be stripped away one by one, because those same liberal values present a challenge to the authoritarian model of rule. Any opinion contrary to the official state position would not be tolerated, and your national government would be made up of Kremlin-approved leadership that works to support a Russian-first agenda. As Putin today gathers much of his support from ultra-conservative Russians, you can also expect to see a dramatic reversal in race and sex equality, as well as the rights of LGBTQ citizens. Nationalism would be on the rise around the world, though ultimately all would swear allegiance to one man and one man alone, your new Vladidadi, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Thankfully, to even come close to achieving global hegemony, Putin would first have to neutralize both China and America. If Russia's invasion of Ukraine has proven anything, though, it's that Russia is completely incapable of such a task, and if anything, Putin must accept that he now lives in a world dominated by the West. Ultimately, it's up to the Russian people if they're willing to turn into a modern North Korea-style hermit kingdom, or if they'll remove Putin and his henchmen from power and end Russia's decades-long zero-sum game versus the world. Because while Putin is busy telling his own population that the West hates them, us Westerners are too busy enjoying euphoria, stupid TikTok dances, and the latest Pokemon game to care about a rivalry with Russia. Snow falls in the frigid Siberian Arctic, where an American force shelters in a small village along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Suddenly, an explosion decimates the side of a building. From across the tracks, a Bolshevik force comes flooding out of the forest. The Russians fire their rifles. With each bullet, a stream of smoke exits their muzzles as it drifts in the freezing air. The Americans return fire. They're about to be overrun by angry Russian soldiers. No one wants to die in this frozen wasteland, so a retreat is ordered. The platoon of Americans covers one another as they run down the railway toward another regiment stationed to the north. The craziest thing is that the US soldiers aren't entirely sure why they invaded Russia in the first place, and now they're paying dearly for it. About a year before the United States sent troops to Russia, Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky incited the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The US had just deployed troops in Europe to help the Allies defeat the Germans in World War I. When the revolution happened, the new communist regime pulled Russia out of the conflict and agreed to a tentative truce with Germany. The Allies continued to fight on, and eventually the tide of the war turned. By the following year, the Bolsheviks controlled a large part of Western Russia, but forces identifying themselves as the White Russians fought to take back their country from the Communists. This group was made up of a motley crew of mostly loyalists and reactionaries, with some Democrats sprinkled in, all of which were against Russia becoming a communist state. At this point, American troops had been engaged in battles across Europe, and the German army was slowly falling to the Allied forces. On November 11, 1918, World War I came to an end, but as American soldiers prepared to return home from the brutality of war, a select group was ordered to remain behind. These soldiers were sent on a mission in northern Russia to help the White Russians maintain control of an important railway that allowed supplies to be transported to areas where the White and Red armies were engaged in battle. The United States maintained that they were staying out of the internal affairs of Russia, but secretly President Woodrow Wilson and other Allied leaders knew that if the Bolsheviks were victorious and defeated the White Russian forces, the country would become a full-fledged communist state that would pose a threat to capitalism and democracy around the world. 2 American forces were ordered to go over the Russian border and help maintain supply lines for the war against the Red Army. The wording used by Wilson for these missions was vague and had no clear goal. This was likely because if the United States took a side in the conflict playing out in Russia, they could be thrown into another war. The invasion needed to remain as covert as possible, and having no clear orders or objectives, the American soldiers within the borders of Russia were given plausible deniability. Unfortunately, having troops stationed within a country undergoing civil war can only lead to rising tensions and casualties. The US troops, who were now technically an invasion force in Russia, found themselves in a very dangerous situation. The Bolsheviks were becoming more and more powerful. It would only be a matter of time before the American forces and the Red Army met. When this happened, the United States would have to take a stand, or at least make some very difficult decisions. The invasion of Russia technically began in July 1918. The war in Europe could still have gone either way, but the Allies seemed to be losing. Since Germany no longer needed to worry about protecting their eastern front due to their newly formed peace with the Bolshevik government, German forces were able to focus on pushing west. They advanced further and further into France, leaving a wake of destruction in their path. The only way the German advance could be stopped was if the Allies somehow reopened the eastern front. British and French expeditionary forces were already in northern Russia, where they were working to open up this new front. At that same time, they hoped to supply the White Russian forces with resources that would allow them to defeat the Bolsheviks and rejoin the war. The other Allied leaders convinced Woodrow Wilson to send 13,000 troops across the Russian border to help with this effort. President Wilson agreed, and when American troops crossed into Russia, the invasion had officially begun. Since the United States wanted to maintain some form of deniability that what they were doing was not actually an invasion, Woodrow Wilson wrote a vaguely worded memo. The American expeditionary forces being sent to Russia had 3 main objectives. The first, guarding large caches of Allied weapons and supplies that were housed in Archangel and Vladivostok. These supplies were sent to the Russian cities before the country left the war, and therefore Allied command wanted to make sure they did not fall into the hands of the Red Army. The second objective was to support the 70,000 soldiers in the Czechoslovak Legion who were still a part of Allied forces in World War I. The Czech Legion was fighting the Red Army in Siberia, and since they were part of the Allies, the United States soldiers were to support them in any way they could. The final objective that Woodrow Wilson put into his memo was that the US soldiers were to avoid interfering with internal Russian affairs. However, they were also supposed to aid the Russians in self-governing or self-defense. Basically, Wilson was saying that the American soldiers should be helping the White Russians defeat the Bolsheviks by any means necessary, but they were not to let the communists find out that that was what they were doing. The reason that Wilson couldn't just outright say the US forces entered Russia to try to defeat the Bolsheviks was that it would have looked like they were declaring a war against a previous ally, but the lack of clarity around what the troops were actually doing in Russia ended up causing all sorts of confusion. This resulted in a very different mission evolving and the loss of hundreds of American lives. The US soldiers who were deployed to Russia were a part of the 339th Regiment. This group of soldiers was mostly from Michigan, which military strategists decided would make them ideal for the extreme cold that they would face in northern Russia. Before the invasion force left for their mission, they were trained in England by Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton to give them additional skills to survive in the brutal environment they were about to enter. After their training, the 339th packed their bags, boarded a plane, and flew to the Archangel, which sat just below the Arctic Circle. The men nicknamed their regiment the Polar Bear Expedition, which wouldn't be too far from the truth. As they approached the Archangel, temperature plummeted and the wind picked up. The soldiers looked out of the plane windows at the frozen landscape below. This mission was going to be brutal, and they weren't even entirely sure why they were there. Once the planes landed, the US soldiers were debriefed by the British commander stationed at Archangel. Although their orders were only to defend the cache of Allied supplies in the city, this turned out to be a very small part of what they would actually end up doing. The British told the Americans to suit up as they were about to leave Archangel and head southeast toward Kaulas. This was not what they'd been instructed to do, but at that same time, the vagueness of their orders also meant they could pretty much do anything they wanted. The 339th deployed with the British soldiers to Kaulas. Their goal was to secure a railroad crossing that they could then use to connect supply lines to the Czechoslovak Legion fighting the Red Army to the east. British officer Lieutenant General Frederick Poole ordered the Polar Bear Expedition Force to sweep south along a critical railroad track and remove any Bolshevik forces that stood in their way. The Polar Bears moved down the railroad toward Kaulas. They encountered small bands of Bolshevik soldiers who they easily dispatched. The weather conditions were brutal, but the men had all been well trained. They pushed the Bolsheviks away from the railway and secured long stretches of it to aid in the movement of troops and supplies to other forces fighting the Red Army in the Siberian region. Unfortunately, the Polar Bears would never make it all the way to Kaulas. On November 11, 1918, the same day that World War I ended in Europe, the American soldiers found themselves in a bloody battle against Bolshevik forces. The Polar Bear Expedition, along with Canadian and Scottish troops, were making their way south when they encountered a large Red Army force. Bullets pelted the snow all around them as the Polar Bears dove for cover. The Red Army had captured a town along the railway and still had a large number of men stationed there. Grenades blew craters around the tracks. The Allied forces returned fire but were unable to break the Bolshevik line. They had to retreat back to the dense forest and regroup. When they reached safety, the soldiers heard the news that Armistice Day had been celebrated in France. They couldn't believe that while they were being shot at and killed by Russian soldiers, the boys in Europe were being sent home. This was demoralizing and made no sense to the soldiers still stationed in Siberia. If the war was over, why were they still fighting? The soldiers started to complain to their superiors and question what their actual orders in Russia were. Many Allied soldiers once believed that the Bolsheviks were secretly on the side of the Germans, which made fighting them a worthwhile cause. But now that Germany had been defeated, the American soldiers were freezing their butts off for no apparent reason. At this time, Major William Graves commanded another expeditionary force that invaded Russia from Vladivostok. This regiment had been deployed to protect the Allied supplies housed in the city. But like the Polar Bear Expedition in Archangel, these soldiers also had vague orders and would end up pushing further into Siberia than originally planned. Graves wrote later that at the time of the deployment, he was given no information as to the military, political, social, economic, or financial situation in Russia. This shows just how little the American soldiers who found themselves in the middle of a civil war in Russia actually had to go on. As 1918 turned into 1919, the Czechoslovak Legion controlled much of Siberia, including the Trans-Siberian Railway. In order to fulfill the ambiguous orders he was given, Graves ordered troops to be deployed along the railway and at the coal mines, which powered the whole thing. This meant that American forces would be moving further and further into Russia. Although no one wanted to say it, America had now invaded Russia on two fronts. The Trans-Siberian Railway was a vital lifeline for both the Czechs and the White Russians that were fighting against the Bolsheviks. Without the railway, supplies could not reach the forces spread throughout the country. But as the Americans worked to secure and maintain control of the railway, the White Russians did something drastic. In November 1918, a White Russian admiral named Alexander Kolchak overthrew a Czech-supported government in Siberia. This caused panic amongst the Czechoslovak Legion. Rather than continuing their fighting against the Red Army in northern Russia, they focused their attention on returning home. This put Graves in a precarious position. It was now his sole responsibility to maintain control of the Trans-Siberian Railway and secretly move supplies to the Polar Bears and other forces who were trying to capture Kolchak. In January of 1919, the Bolsheviks launched attacks along the Trans-Siberian Railway and deeper into Siberia, where American forces were positioned. It all started one freezing day 500 miles north of Moscow. Lieutenant Harry Meade and his platoon of 47 Polar Bears were held up in a small Russian village. They lit fires within the snow-covered homes as the temperature dipped to 45 degrees below zero. They received word that the Red Army might be advancing on their position, but wouldn't reach them for several more days, at which point they would be long gone, or so they believed. Lookouts had been posted and the soldiers took shifts digging trenches into the frozen permafrost that surrounded the small village just in case they needed to defend themselves. The sun rose on January 19, 1919, causing a pink hue across the freshly fallen snow that made it look like cotton candy. One of the lookouts rubbed his eyes and stretched. He'd been up all night keeping an eye out for the enemy. It had been quiet, and his shift was about to end when he saw something move in the trees out of the corner of his eye. The sun was still low, and the trees from the forest cast long shadows along the railway. The darkness from the densely packed pine trees kept anything hidden within it. The lookout grabbed his binoculars and stared at the forest. He could have sworn something moved just on the edge of the trees. Perhaps it was a deer or a lone wolf. He put the binoculars down and rubbed his eyes, chalking whatever he thought he saw up to exhaustion. Suddenly, dozens of rifles fired simultaneously from the tree line. Rockets flashed as they ejected from their launchers and slammed into the buildings of the villages. The men started screaming as wood and rocks flew everywhere. Meade awoke his troops and ordered them to return fire. A wall of screaming Bolshevik soldiers ran out from the cover of the forest. The sunlight glinted off their bayonets attached to the rifles. The Americans continued firing, but there were just too many of them. Meade ordered his men to fall back and seek shelter. The Red Army soldiers shot at the retreating polar bears, killing several men in the ambush before they could scramble behind cover. Meade and his men took shelter in the buildings on the far side of the village just as shells began to fall from the sky. The Bolsheviks had set up mortars on the outskirts of the town and were unleashing a barrage of explosives that decimated the structures the Americans had taken shelter in. When the iron rain stopped falling, Meade peered out of the window and saw a terrifying sight. Bolshevik soldiers had moved to the flanks and were now closing in on three sides. They wore white uniforms and jackets that allowed them to blend in with the snowy landscape. The enemy looked more like ghosts than men. Meade ordered the machine guns to be mounted in the windows to keep the Bolsheviks at bay, but every time the polar bears would slow the Bolshevik advance on one side, the other two would move closer. It was a hopeless situation. The waves of Bolshevik soldiers never seemed to end. It was only a matter of time before Meade and his men's position was overrun and the Red Army slaughtered them all. Meade ordered a full retreat. The American soldiers exited the houses they were taking shelter in and headed for the edge of town. Every time they stepped out from behind cover, someone else was gunned down. The Bolsheviks were unrelenting and ruthless. If a polar bear fell, their body had to be left behind. 25 Americans died in the battle. Their bodies lie where they fell, so the rest of the expeditionary force could make it out of the village alive and retreat further up the railway. When Meade and his men met up with another American platoon, they had lost over half of their force and had 15 injured soldiers who desperately needed medical attention. This was the beginning of the Bolsheviks' offensive into northern Russia in January of 1919. The Red Army had the Polar Bear expedition outnumbered 8-1. They pushed the Americans further and further north. It seemed that if something wasn't done to immediately bring the men home, they would either be driven all the way to the Arctic or killed by the Bolsheviks. Politicians and military leaders worked tirelessly to try and get the U.S. soldiers home, but there were still those in government who believed the polar bears needed to be kept in Russia to keep the country from falling to the Bolsheviks. The Polar Bear expedition was pushed all the way back to Archangel, where they'd held out until May when the ice began to thaw and the White Sea became passable. As the men loaded up everything of importance onto the ships leaving the city to head back to Europe, the Bolsheviks began to seize Archangel. Battles broke out on the outskirts of the city, but eventually the Red Army gained the upper hand and the Bolsheviks pushed into Archangel. Fights broke out in the streets as polar bears desperately tried to hold the Bolsheviks at bay for as long as possible. The ships were finally loaded, and the Allied forces still in Russia managed to escape. On June 15, 1919, the last of the Polar Bear expedition left Archangel and headed back home. In all, around 235 Americans died on the Western Front of the invasion of Russia, and not a single man could explain exactly why they were there in the first place. As the polar bears were headed home, the American soldiers who had been launched from Vladivostok continued to fight in Siberia. Even though the Polar Bear expedition had been a disaster, Woodrow Wilson still wanted American troops in Russia to maintain control of the Trans-Siberian Railway and to keep the White forces resupplied. However, there was a new threat looming on the horizon. Japan had been a former ally during World War I, but had quickly become aggressive as the emperor dreamed of expanding his country's borders and influence. 72,000 Japanese soldiers were launched across the sea and landed in Siberia. They advanced toward Major William Graves and the American forces that held the railway. Even though they had once been allies, the Japanese soldiers no longer were considered friendlies. Their expansion into Asia and Siberia posed a serious threat to the White Russians and the American men who were still there. As all this was happening, Graves' worst nightmare came true. The very army they were trying to help turned on them. The White Russians wanted the Americans to either formally fight with them or get out. They were tired of American forces being in their country without choosing a side. The Japanese troops shared the same sentiment but wanted the Americans out of the region for their own reasons. Without the Americans there, the Japanese would be able to advance further into Siberia and claim the Trans-Siberian Railway for themselves. White Russian forces began to work with Japanese forces as they swept through Siberia, causing unprecedented amounts of carnage and chaos. Innocent people were executed and tortured. Cossack generals Grigory Semenov and Ivan Kalmykov roamed the frozen regions of the country, killing anyone they thought was sympathetic to the Bolshevik cause and taking whatever they wanted with the support of Japanese troops. Eventually, these forces turned their attention toward the Americans. It seemed that fighting would break out between the US soldiers still stationed along the Trans-Siberian Railway and the White Russians at any moment. If this happened, the United States would have no choice but to openly declare war and either send more troops to Russia or risk the lives of the Americans stuck in Siberia. As tensions rose, the Bolsheviks became stronger and stronger. They secured more cities and transportation routes while growing in numbers. The White Russians were losing badly on all fronts. Admiral Alexander Kolchak pleaded with the Czech Legion for help, but he'd already burnt that bridge when the White Russians invaded Czechoslovakian territory and committed countless crimes against the people in the region. Rather than helping Kolchak, the Czechoslovakians turned him over to the Red Army in return for safe passage home. In January of 1920, Woodrow Wilson and his advisors decided the secret war in Russia had failed. They ordered all U.S. troops out of the country as the Trans-Siberian Railway was all but lost to the Bolsheviks. By April 1, 1920, the last of the American invasion forces was withdrawn from Russian borders. 189 men were lost in Siberia. Each one had only a very vague idea of what they were doing there in the first place. Woodrow Wilson's decision to invade and keep troops in Russia in order to influence its internal affairs foreshadowed future endeavors by the United States to do similar things in other countries. The U.S. had no business being in Russia after World War I, just as it had no business being in other countries later in the century. Now watch What's Wrong with Russia's Military, or check out These Countries Are Impossible to Invade.